Day the fourth. The Introduction. In this year, the third day of the Decameron, beginneth the fourth, in which, under the rule of Philostrato, discourse is had of those whose loves had a disastrous close. Dearest ladies, as well from what I heard in converse with the wise, as from matters that not seldom fell within my own observation and reading, I formed the opinion that the vehement and scorching blast of envy was apt to vent itself only upon lofty towers or the highest tree tops. But therein I find that I misjudged; for, whereas I ever thought and studied how best to elude the buffetings of that furious hurricane, and to that end kept a course not merely on the plain, but by preference in the depths of the valley, I should be abundantly clear to whose looks at these little stories, written as they are not only in the vulgar Florentine, and in prose, and without dedicatory flourish, but also in as homely and simple a style as may be. Nevertheless, all this has not stood me in such stead, but that I have been shrewdly shaken, nay, all but uprooted by the blast, and altogether lacerated by the bite of this same envy. Whereby I may very well understand that it's true, what the sages aver, that only misery is exempt from envy in the present life. Know then, discreet ladies, that some there are, who, reading these little stories, have alleged that I am too fond of you, and that it is not a seemly thing that I should take so much pleasure in ministering to your gratification and solace, and some have found more fault with me for praising you as I do. Others, affecting to deliver a more considered judgment, have said that it ill befits my time of life to eschew such matters, to wit, the discoursing of women, or endeavouring to pleasure them; and not a few, feigning a mighty tender regard to my fame, aver that I should do more wisely to keep ever with the Muses on Parnassus, than to foregather with you in such vain dalliance. Those again there are, who, evincing less wisdom than despite, have told me that I should shew sounder sense, if I bethought me how to get my daily bread, than going after these idle toys, to nourish myself upon the wind; while certain others, in disparagement of my work, strive might and main to make it appear that the matters which I relate fell out otherwise than as I set them forth. Such then, noble ladies, are the blasts, such the sharp and cruel fangs, by which, while I champion your cause, I am assailed, harassed, and well nigh pierced through and through; which censures I hear and mark, God knows, with equal mind; and though to you belongs all my defence, yet I mean not to be niggard of my own powers, but rather, without dealing out to them the castigation they deserve, to give them such slight answer as may secure my ears some respite of their clamour, and that without delay. Seeing that if already, though I have not completed the third part of my work, they are not a few and very presumptuous, I deem it possible that before I have reached the end, should they receive no check, they may have grown so numerous that it would scarce tax their powers to sink me, and that your forces, great though they be, would not suffice to withstand them. However, I am minded to answer none of them until I have related in my behoof, not indeed an entire story, for I would not seem to foist my stories in among those of so honourable a company as that with which I have made you acquainted, but a part of one that is very incompleteness may show that it is not one of them. Wherefore, addressing my assailants, I say, that in our city there was in old time a citizen named Philippa Balducci, a man of quite low origin, but of good substance and well versed and expert in matters belonging to his condition, who had a wife that he most dearly loved, as did she him, so that their life passed in peace and concord, nor there was aught they studied so much as how to please each other perfectly. Now it came to pass, as it does to every one, that the good lady departed this life, leaving Philippa enough of hers, but an only son, that she had had by him, and who was then about 2 years old. His wife's death left Philippa as disconsolate as ever was any man for the loss of a loved one, and sorely missing the companionship that was most dear to him, he resolved to have done with the world, and devote himself and his little son to the service of God. Wherefore, having dedicated all his goods to charitable uses, he forthwith betook him to the summit of Monte Asinaio, where he installed himself with his son in a little cell, and living on alms passed his days in fasting and prayer, being careful above all things to say nothing to the boy of any temporal matters, nor to let him see aught of the kind, lest they should distract his mind from his religious exercises, but discoursing with him continually of the glory of the life eternal, and of God and the saints, and teaching him naught else but holy orisons, in which way of life he kept him not a few years, never suffering him to quit the cell or see aught but himself. From time to time the worthy man would go to Florence, where divers of the faithful would afford him relief according to his needs, and so he would return to his cell. And thus it fell out that one day Filippo, now an aged man, being asked by the boy, who was about 18 years old, whither he went, told him. Whereupon, Father, said the boy, you are now old and scarce able to support fatigue. Why take you me not with you for once to Florence, and give me to know devout friends of God, and you, so that I, who am young and fitter for such exertion than you, may thereafter go to Florence for our supplies at your pleasure, and you remain here? The worthy man, bethinking him that his son was now grown up, and so habituated to the service of God as hardly to be seduced by the things of the world, said to himself, He says tell. And so, as he must needs go to Florence, he took the boy with him, where, seeing the palaces, the houses, the churches, and all matters else with which the city abounds, and of which he had no more recollection than if he had never seen them, the boy found all passing strange, and questioned his father of not a few of them, what they were and how they were named, his curiosity being no sooner satisfied in one particular than he plied his father with a further question. And so it befell that, while son and father were thus occupied in asking and answering questions, they encountered a bevy of damsels, fair and richly arrayed, being on their return from a wedding, whom the young man no sooner saw than he asked his father what they might be. My son, answered the father, fix thy gaze on the ground, regard them not at all, for naughty things are they. Oh, said the son, and what is their name? The father, fearing to awaken some mischievous craving of concupiscence in the young man, would not denote them truly, to wit as women, but said, They are called goslings. Whereupon, wonderful to tell, the lad, who had never before set eyes of any woman, thought no more of the palaces, the oxen, the horses, the asses, the money, or aught else that he had seen, but exclaimed, Prithee, father, let me have one of those goslings. Alas, my son, replied the father, speak not of them, they are naughty things. Oh, questioned the son, but are naughty things made like that? Ay, returned the father. Whereupon the son, I know not, he said, what you say, nor why they should be naughty things. For my part I have as yet seen naught that seemed to me so fair and delectable. They are fairer than the painted angels that you have so often shown me. Oh, if you love me, do but let us take one of these goslings up there, and I will see that she have whereon to bill. Nay, said the father, that will not I. Thou knowest not whereon they bill. And straightway, being ware that nature was more potent than his art, he repented him that he had brought the boy to Florence. But enough of this story. 'Tis time for me to cut it short, and return for those for whose instruction it is told. They say then, some of these my censors, that I am too fond of you, young ladies, and am at too great pains to pleasure you. Now that I am fond of you, and am at pains to pleasure you, I do most frankly and fully confess, and I ask them whether, considering only all that it means to have had, and to have continually, before one's eyes your debonair demeanour, your bewitching beauty and exquisite grace, and therewithal your modest womanliness, not to speak of having known the amorous kisses, the caressing embraces, the voluptuous comminglings, whereof our intercourse with you, ladies most sweet, not seldom is productive. They do verily marvel that I am fond of you, seeing that one who was nurtured, reared, and brought up on a savage and solitary mountain, within the narrow circuit of a cell, without other companion than his father, had no sooner seen you than it was you alone that he desired, that he demanded, that he sought with ardour. Will they tear, will they lacerate me with their censures, if I, whose body heaven fashioned all apt for love, whose soul from very boyhood was dedicated to you, am not insensible to the power of the light of your eyes, to the sweetness of your honeyed words, to the flame that is kindled by your gentle sighs, but am fond of you, and sedulous to pleasure you. You, again, I bid them remember, in whom I hermit, a rude witless lad, liker to an animal than a human being, found more to delight him than in aught else that he saw. Of a truth who taxes me thus, must be one that, feeling, knowing naught of the pleasure and power of natural affection, loves you not, nor craves your love, and such an one I hold in light esteem. And as for those that go about to find ground of exception in my age, they do but show that they ill understand that the leek, albeit its head in white, has a green tail. But jesting apart, thus I answer them, that never to the end of my life shall I deem it shameful to me to pleasure those to whom Guido Cavalcanti and Dante Alighieri in their old age, and Messer Signo da Pistoia in extreme old age, accounted it an honour and found it a delight to minister gratification. And but that it were a deviation from the use and wont of discourse, I would call history to my aid, and show it to abound with stories of noble men of old time, who in their ripest age studied above all things else to pleasure the ladies, whereof if they be ignorant, go they and get them to school. To keep with the muses on Parnassus is counsel I approve, but tarry with them always we cannot, nor they with us, nor is a man blameworthy, if, when he happen to part from them, he find his delight in those that resemble them. The muses are ladies, and albeit ladies are not the peers of the muses, yet they have their outward semblance, for which cause, if not for other, it's reasonable that I should be fond of them. Besides which, ladies have been to me the occasion of composing some 1,000 verses, but of never a verse that I made were the muses the occasion. Howbeit it was with their aid, it was under their influence that I composed those 1,000 verses, and perchance they have sometimes visited me to encourage me in my present task, humble indeed though it be, doing honour and paying, as it were, tribute to the likeness which the ladies have to them. Wherefore, while I weave these stories, I stray not so far from Mount Parnassus and the muses, as not a few perchance suppose. But what shall we say to those, in whom my hunger excites such commiseration, that they bid me get me bread? Verily I know not, save this. Suppose that in my need I were to beg bread of them, what would be their answer? I doubt not they would say, Go seek it among the fables. And in sooth the poets have found more bread among their fables than many rich men among their treasures. And many that have gone after fables have crowned their days with splendour, while, on the other hand, not a few, in the endeavour to get them more bread than they needed, have perished miserably. But why waste more words on them? Let them send me packing, when I ask bread of them, not that, thank God, I have yet need of it, and should I ever come to be in need of it, I know, like the Apostle, how to abound and to be in want, and so I am minded to be beholden to none but myself. As for those who say that these matters fell out otherwise than as I relate them, I should account it no small favour, if they would produce the originals, and should what I write not accord with them, I would acknowledge the justice of their censure, and study to amend my ways. But, until better evidence is forthcoming than their words, I shall adhere to my own opinion, without seeking to deprive them of theirs, and give them tit for tat. And being minded that for this while this answer suffice, I say that with God and you, in whom I trust, most gentle ladies, to aid and protect me, and patience for my stay, I shall go forward with my work, turning my back on this tempest, however it may rage. For I see not that I can fare worse than the fine dust, which the blast of the whirlwind either leaves where it lies, or bears aloft, not seldom over the heads of men, over the crowns of kings, of emperors, and sometimes suffers to settle on the roofs of lofty palaces, and the summits of the tallest towers, whence if it fall, it cannot sink lower than the level from which it was raised. And if I ever devoted myself and all my powers to minister in any wise to your gratification, I am now minded more than ever so to do, because I know that there is naught that any can justly say in regard thereof, but that I, and others who love you, follow the promptings of nature, whose laws whoso would withstand has need of powers preeminent, and even so will ofttimes labour not merely in vain, but to his own most grievous disadvantage. Such powers I own that I neither have, nor to such end desire to have, and had I them, I would rather leave them to another than use them myself. Wherefore let my detractors hold their peace, and if they cannot get heat, why, let them shiver their life away, and, while they remain addicted to their delights, or rather corrupt tastes, let them leave me to follow my own bent during the brief life that is accorded us. But this had been a long digression, fair ladies, and it is time to retrace our steps to the point where we deviated, and continue in the course on which we started. The sun had chased every star from the sky, and lifted the dank murk of night from the earth, when, Philostrato being risen, and having roused all his company, they hied them to the fair garden, and there fell to disporting themselves. The time for breakfast being come, they took it where they had supped on the preceding evening, and after they had slept they rose, when the sun was in his zenith, and seated themselves in their wonted manner by the beautiful fountain, where Fiammetta, being bidden by Philostrato to lead off the story-telling, awaited no second command, but debonairly thus began. End of Introduction of Day 4th.
Day 4. The First Story. Tancred, Prince of Salerno, slays his daughter's lover, and sends her his heart in a golden cup. She pours upon it a poisonous distillation, which she drinks and dies. A direful theme has our king allotted us for today's discourse, seeing that, whereas we are here met for our common delectation, needs must we now tell of others' tears, whereby, whether telling or hearing, we cannot but be moved to pity. Perchance 'twas to temper, in some degree, the gaiety of the past days, that he so ordained, but whatever may have been his intent, his will must be to me immutable law. Wherefore I will narrate to you a matter that befell piteously, nay, woefully, and so as you may well weep thereat. Tancred, Prince of Salerno, a lord most humane and kind of heart, but that in his old age he embrued his hands in the blood of a lover, had in the whole course of his life but one daughter, and had he not had her, he had been more fortunate. Never was a daughter more tenderly beloved of a father than she of the prince, who for that course, not knowing how to part with her, kept her unmarried for many a year after she had come of marriageable age. But then, at last, he gave her to a son of the Duke of Capua, with whom she had lived but a short while, when he died, and she returned to her father. Most lovely was she of form and feature, never woman more so, and young and light of heart, and more knowing, perchance, than beseemed a woman. Dwelling thus with her loving father, as a great lady in no small luxury, nor feeling to see that the prince, for the great love he bore her, was at no pains to provide her with another husband, and deeming it unseemly on her part to ask one of him, she cast about how she might come by a gallant to be her secret lover. And seeing at her father's court not a few men, both gentle and simple, that resorted thither, as we know men used to frequent courts, and closely scanning their mien and manners, she preferred before all others the prince's page, Guiscardo by name, a man of very humble origin, but preeminent for native worth and noble bearing, of whom, seeing him frequently, she became hotly enamoured, hourly extolling his qualities more and more highly. The young man, who for all his youth by no means lacked shrewdness, read her heart, and gave her his own on such wise that his love for her engrossed his mind to the exclusion of almost everything else. While thus they burned in secret for one another, the lady, desiring of all things a meeting with Guiscardo, but being shy of making any her confidant, hit upon a novel expedient to concert the affair with him. She wrote him a letter containing her commands for the ensuing day, and thrust it into a cane in the space between two of the knots, which cane she gave to Guiscardo, saying, "Thou canst let thy servant have it for a bellows to blow thy fire up to-night." Guiscardo took it, and feeling sure that 'twas not unadvisedly that she made him such a present, accompanied with such words, hied him straight home, where, carefully examining the cane, he observed that it was cleft, and opening it, found the letter; which he had no sooner read and learned what he was to do, than, pleased as ne'er another, he fell to devising how to set all in order that he might not fail to meet the lady on the following day, after the manner she had prescribed. Now hard by the prince's palace was a grotto, hewn in days of old in the solid rock, and now long disused, so that an artificial orifice by which it received a little light was all but choked with brambles and plants that grew about and overspread it. From one of the ground-floor rooms of the palace, which room was part of the lady's suite, a secret stair led to the grotto, though the entrance was barred by a very strong door. This stair, having been from time immemorial disused, had passed out of mind so completely that there was scarce any that remembered it was there, but love, whose eyes nothing, however secret, may escape, had brought it to the mind of the enamoured lady. For many a day, using all secrecy, that none should discover her, she had wrought with her tools until she had succeeded in opening the door, which done, she had gone down into the grotto alone, and having observed the orifice, had by her letter apprised Guiscardo of its apparent height above the floor of the grotto, and bidden him contrive some means of descending thereby. Eager to carry the affair through, Guiscardo lost no time in digging up a ladder of ropes, whereby he might ascend and descend, and having put on a suit of leather to protect him from the brambles, he hied him the following night, keeping the affair close from all, to the orifice, made the ladder fast by one of its ends to a massive trunk that was rooted in the mouth of the orifice, climbed down the ladder, and awaited the lady. On the morrow, making as if she would fain sleep, the lady dismissed her damsels, and locked herself into her room. She then opened the door of the grotto, hied her down, and met Guiscardo, to their marvellous mutual satisfaction. The lovers then repaired to her room, where in exceeding great joyance they spent no small part of the day. Nor were they neglectful of the precautions needful to prevent discovery of their amour, but in due time Guiscardo returned to the grotto, whereupon the lady locked the door and rejoined her damsels. At nightfall Guiscardo reascended his ladder, and issuing forth of the orifice, hied him home, nor, knowing now the way, did he fail to revisit the grotto many a time thereafter. But fortune, noting with envious eyes a happiness of such degree and duration, gave to events a dolorous turn, whereby the joy of the two lovers was converted into bitter lamentation. 'Twas Tancred's custom to come from time to time quite alone to his daughter's room, and tarry talking with her a while. Whereby it so befell that he came down there one day after breakfast, while Gismonda, such was the lady's name, was in her garden with her damsels, so that none saw or heard him enter, nor would he call his daughter, for he was minded that she should not forego her pleasure. But finding the windows closed and the bed curtains drawn down, he seated himself on a divan that stood at one end of the corners of the bed, rested his head on the bed, drew the curtain over him, and thus, hidden as if of set purpose, fell asleep. As he slept, Gismonda, who, as it happened, had caused Guiscardo to come that day, left her damsels in the garden, softly entered the room, and having locked herself in, unwitting that there was another in the room, opened the door to Guiscardo, who was waiting. Straightway they got them to bed, as was their wont, and while they there solaced and disported them together, so it befell that Tancred awoke, and heard and saw what they did, whereat he was troubled beyond measure, and at first was minded to upbraid them, but on second thoughts he deemed it best to hold his peace, and avoid discovery, if so he might with greater stealth and less dishonour carry out the design which was already in his mind. The two lovers continued long together, as they were wont, all unwitting of Tancred, but at length they saw fit to go out of bed, when Guiscardo went back to the grotto, and the lady hied her forth of the room. Whereupon Tancred, old though he was, got out at one of the windows, clambered down into the garden, and, seen by none, returned sorely troubled to his room. By his command, two men took Guiscardo early that same night, as he issued forth of the orifice accoutred in his suit of leather, and brought him privily to Tancred, who, as he saw him, all but wept, and said, Guiscardo, my kindness to thee is ill requited by the outrage and dishonour which thou hast done me in the person of my daughter, as today I have seen with my own eyes. To which Guiscardo could answer naught but, Love is more potent than either you or I. Tancred then gave order to keep him privily under watch and ward in a room within the palace, and so it was done. Next day, while Gismonda wotted naught of these matters, Tancred, after pondering divers novel expedients, hied him after breakfast, according to his wont, to his daughter's room, where, having called her to him and locked himself in with her, he began, not without tears, to speak on this wise. Gismonda, conceiving that I knew thy virtue and honour, never, though it had been reported to me, would I have credited, had I not seen with my own eyes, that thou wouldst so much as in idea, not to say fact, have ever yielded thyself to any man but thy husband. Wherefore, for the brief residue of life that my age has in store for me, the memory of thy fall will ever be grievous to me. And would to God, as thou must needs demean thyself to such dishonour, thou hadst taken a man that matched thy nobility, but of all the men that frequent my court, thou must needs choose Guiscardo, a young man of the lowest condition, a fellow whom we brought up in charity from his tender years, for whose sake thou hast plunged me into the abyss of mental tribulation, insomuch that I know not what course to take in regard of thee. As to Guiscardo, whom I caused to be arrested last night as he issued from the orifice, and kept in durance, my course is already taken. But how am I to deal with thee, God knows I know not. I am distraught between the love which I have ever borne thee, love such as no father ever bare to daughter, and the most just indignation evoked in me by thy signal folly. My love prompts me to pardon thee, my indignation bids me harden my heart against thee, though I do violence to my nature. But before I decide upon my course, I would fain hear what thou hast to say to this. So saying, he bent his head, and wept as bitterly as any child that had been soundly thrashed. Her father's words, and the tidings they conveyed, that not only was her secret passion discovered, but Guiscardo taken, caused Gismonda immeasurable grief, which she was again and again on the point of evincing, as most women do, by cries and tears, but her high spirit triumphed over this weakness. By a prodigious effort she composed her countenance, and taking it for granted that her Guiscardo was no more, she inly devoted herself to death rather than a single prayer for herself should escape her lips. Wherefore, not as a woman stricken with grief or chidden for a fault, but unconcerned and unabashed, with tearless eyes, and frank and utterly dauntless mien, thus answered she her father: "Tancred, your accusation I shall not deny, neither will I cry you mercy, for naught should I gain by denial, nor aught would I gain by supplication. Nay more, there is naught I will do to conciliate thy humanity and love. My only care is to confess the truth, to defend my honor by words of sound reason, and then by deeds most resolute to give effect to the promptings of my high soul. True it is that I have loved and loved Guiscardo, and during the brief while I have yet to live shall love him. Nor after death, so there be then love, shall I cease to love him. But that I love him is not imputable to my womanly frailty so much as to the little zeal thou showedst me for my bestowal in marriage, and to Guiscardo's own worth. It should not have escaped thee, Tancred, creature of flesh and blood as thou art, that thy daughter was also a creature of flesh and blood, and not of stone or iron. It was, and is, thy duty to bear in mind, old though thou art, the nature and the might of the laws to which youth is subject, and though thou hast spent part of thy best years in martial exercises, thou shouldst nevertheless have not been ignorant how potent is the influence even upon the aged, to say nothing of the young, of ease and luxury. And not only am I, as being your daughter, a creature of flesh and blood, but my life is not so far spent, but I am still young, and thus doubly fraught with fleshly appetite, the vehemence whereof is marvellously enhanced by reason that, having been married, I have known the pleasure that ensues upon the satisfaction of such desire. Which forces being powerless to withstand, I did but act as was natural in a young woman, when I gave way to them, and yielded myself to love. Nor in sooth did I fail to the utmost of my power so to order the indulgence of my natural propensity that my sin should bring shame neither upon thee nor upon me. To which end love in his pity and fortune in a friendly mood found and discovered me a secret way whereby non-witting I attained my desire. This from whomsoever thou hast learned it, howsoever thou comest to know it, I deny not. 'Twas not at random, as many women do, that I loved Guiscardo, but by deliberate choice I preferred him before all other men, and of determinate forethought I lured him to my love, whereof through his and my discretion and constancy I have long had joyance. Wherein 'twould seem that thou, following rather the opinion of the vulgar than the dictates of truth, find cause to chide me more severely than in my sinful love. For as if thou wouldst not have been vexed, had my choice fallen on a nobleman, thou complainest that I have foregathered with a man of low condition, and dost not see that therein thou censurest not my fault but that of fortune, which not seldom raises the unworthy of high place and leaves the worthiest in low estate. But leave we this. Consider a little the principle of things. Thou seest that in regard of our flesh we are all moulded of the same substance, and that all souls are endowed by one and the same Creator with equal faculties, equal powers, equal virtues. 'Twas merit that made the first distinction between us, born as we were, nay, as we are, all equal. And those whose merits were and were approved in act the greatest were called noble, and the rest were not so denoted. Which law, albeit overlaid by the contrary usage of after times, is not yet abrogated, nor so impaired that it is still traceable in nature and good manners. For which course whoso with merit acts does plainly show himself a gentleman, and if any denote him otherwise, the default is his own, and not his whom he so denotes. Pass in review all thy nobles, weigh their merits, their manners and bearing, and then compare Guiscardo's qualities with theirs. If thou wilt judge without prejudice, thou wilt pronounce him noble in the highest degree, and thy nobles one and all churls. As to Guiscardo's merits and worth, I did but trust the verdict which thou thyself didst utter in words, and which mine own eyes confirmed. Of whom had he such commendation as of thee for all those excellences whereby a good man and true merits commendation? And in sooth thou didst him but justice, for unless mine eyes have played me false, there was naught for which thou didst commend him but I had seen him practise it, and that more admirably than words of thine might express. And had I been at all deceived in this matter, it would have been by thee. Wilt thou say, then, that I have foregathered with a man of low condition? If so, thou wilt not say true. Didst thou say with a poor man, the impeachment might be allowed to thy shame, that thou so ill hast known how to requite a good man and true that is thy servant. But poverty, though it take away all else, deprives no man of gentilesse. Many kings, many great princes were once poor, and many a ditcher or herdsman has been and is very wealthy. As for thy last perpended doubt, to wit, how thou shouldst deal with me, banish it utterly from thy thoughts. If in the extreme old age thou art minded to manifest a harshness unwonted in thy youth, wreak thy harshness on me, resolved as I am to cry thee no mercy, prime cause as I am that this sin, if sin it be, has been committed. For of this I warn thee, that as thou mayst have done or shalt do to Guiscardo, if to me thou do not the like, I with my own hands will do it. Now get thee gone to shed thy tears with the women, and when thy melting mood is over, ruthlessly destroy Guiscardo and me, if such thou deem our merited doom, by one and the same blow. The loftiness of his daughter's spirit was not unknown to the prince, but still he did not credit her with a resolve quite as firmly fixed as her words implied, to carry their purport into effect. So, parting from her without the least intention of using harshness towards her in her own person, he determined to quench the heat of her love by wreaking his vengeance on her lover, and bade the two men that had charge of Guiscardo to strangle him noiselessly that same night, take the heart out of the body, and send it to him. The men did his bidding, and on the morrow the prince had a large and beautiful cup of gold brought to him, and having put Guiscardo's heart therein, sent it by the hand of one of his most trusted servants to his daughter, charging the servant to say, as he gave it to her, "Thy father sends you this, to give thee joy of that which thou lovest best, even as thou hast given him joy of that which he loved best." Now when her father had left her, Gismonda, wavering not a joint in her stern resolve, had sent for poisonous herbs and roots, and therefrom had distilled a water to have it ready for use, if that which she apprehended should come to pass. And when the servant appeared with the prince's present and message, she took the cup unblenchingly, and having lifted the lid, and seen the heart, and apprehended the meaning of the words, and that the heart was beyond a doubt Guiscardo's, she raised her head, and looking straight at the servant, said, "Sepulture less honourable than of gold had ill befitted heart such as this. Herein has my father done wisely." Which said, she raised it to her lips and kissed it, saying, "In all things and at all times, even to the last hour of my life, have I found my father most tender in his love, but now more so than ever before. Wherefore I now render him the last thanks which will ever be due from me to him for his goodly present." So she spoke, and straining the cup to her, bowed her head over it, and gazing at the heart, said, "O sojourn most sweetly of all my joys, accursed be he by whose ruthless act I see thee with the bodily eye. 'Twas enough that to my mind's eye thou wert hourly present. Thou hast run thy course, thou hast closed the span that fortune allotted thee, thou hast reached the goal of all. Thou hast left behind thee the woes and weariness of the world, and thy enemy has himself granted thee sepulture, and accordant with thy deserts. Now circumstance was wanting to duly celebrate thy obsequies, save the tears of her whom, while thou liv'dst, thou didst so dearly love, which that thou shouldst not lack, my remorseless father was prompted of God to send thee to me, and albeit my resolve was fixed to die with eyes unmoistened, and front all unperturbed by fear, yet will I accord thee my tears, which done, my care shall be forthwith by thy means to join my soul to that most precious soul which thou didst once enshrine. And is there other company than hers, in which more of joy and peace I might fare to the abodes unknown? She is yet here within, I doubt not, contemplating the abodes of her and my delights, and, for sure I am that she loves me, awaiting my soul that loves her before all else. Having thus spoken, she bowed herself low over the cup, and, while no womanish cry escaped her, 'twas as if a fountain of water were unloosed within her head, so wondrous a flood of tears gushed from her eyes, while times without number she kissed the dead heart. Her damsels that stood around her knew not whose the heart might be, or what her words might mean, but melting in sympathy they all wept, and compassionately, as vainly, inquired the cause of her lamentation, and in many other ways sought to comfort her to the best of their understanding and power. When she had wept her fill, she raised her head and dried her eyes. Then, "O heart," said she, "much cherished heart, discharged is my every duty towards thee. Naught now remains for me to do but to come and unite my soul with thine." So saying, she sent for the vase that held the water which the day before she had distilled, and emptied it into the cup where lay the heart bathed in her tears. Then, nowise afraid, she set her mouth to the cup and drained it dry, and so with the cup in her hand she got her upon her bed, and having there disposed her person in guise as seemly as she might, laid her dead lover's heart upon her own, and silently awaited death. Meanwhile the damsels, seeing and hearing what passed, but knowing not what the water was that she had drunk, had sent word of each particular to Tancred, who, apprehensive of that which came to pass, came down with all haste to his daughter's room, where he arrived just as she got her upon her bed, and, now too late, addressed himself to comfort her with soft words, and seeing in what plight she was, burst into a flood of bitter tears. To whom the lady, "Reserve thy tears, Tancred, till fortune send thee hap less longed for this. Waste them not on me, who care not for them. Whoever yet saw any but thee bewail the consummation of his desire? But if of the love thou once didst bear me any spark still lives in thee, be it thy parting grace to me, that as thou brookedst not that I should live with Guiscardo in privity and seclusion, so wherever thou mayst have caused Guiscardo's body to be cast, mine may be united with it in the common view of all." The prince replied not, for excess of grief, and the lady, feeling that her end was come, strained the dead heart to her bosom, saying, "Fare ye well, I take my leave of you." And with eyelids drooped and every sense evanished, departed this life of woe. Such was the lamentable end of the loves of Guiscardo and Gismonda, whom Tancred, tardily repentant of his harshness, mourned not a little, as did also all the folk of Salerno, and had honourably interred side by side in the same tomb. End of Day 4, the First Story.
Day 4, the Second Story. Fra Alberto gives a lady to understand that she is beloved of the angel Gabriel, in whose shape he lies with her sundry times. Afterward, for fear of her kinsman, he flings himself forth of her house, and finds shelter in the house of a poor man, who on the morrow leads him in the guise of a wild man into the piazza, where, being recognized, he is apprehended by his brethren and imprisoned.
More than once had Fiammetta's story brought tears to the eyes of her fair companions, but now that it was ended, the king said with an austere air, "I should esteem my life but a paltry price to pay for half the delight that Gismonde had with Guiscardo, whereat no lady of you all should marvel, seeing that each hour that I live I die 1,000 deaths. Nor is there so much as a particle of compensating joy allotted me. But a truce to my own concerns, I ordain that Pompinea do next ensue our direful argument, wherewith the tenor of my life in part accords, and if she follows in Fiammetta's footsteps, I doubt not I shall presently feel some drops of dew distil upon my fire." Pompinea received the king's command in a spirit more accordant with what, from her own bent, she divined to be the wishes of her fair gossips, than with the king's words; wherefore, being minded rather to afford them some diversion, than, save as in duty bound, to satisfy the king, she made choice of the story which, without deviating from the prescribed theme, should move a laugh, and thus began.
"'Tis a proverb, current among the vulgar, that whoso being wicked is righteous reputed, may sin as he will, and 'twill never be imputed. Which proverb furnishes me with abundant matter of discourse, germane to our theme, besides occasion to exhibit the quality and degree of the hypocrisy of the religious, who flaunt it in ample flowing robes, and, with faces made pallid by art, with voices low and gentle to beg alms, most loud and haughty to reprove in others their own sins, would make believe that their way of salvation lies in taking from us, and ours in giving to them. Nay, more, as if they had not, like us, paradise to win, but were already its lords and masters, assign therein to each that dies a place more or less exalted according to the amount of money that he has bequeathed to them, which, if they believe, 'tis by dint of self-delusion, and to the effect of deluding all that put faith in their words. Of whose guile were it lawful for me to make as full exposure as were fitting, not a few simple folk should soon be enlightened as to what they cloak within the folds of their voluminous habits. But would to God all might have the like reward of their lives as a certain friar minor, no novice, but one that was reputed among the greatest at Venice, whose story, rather than aught else, I am minded to tell you, if so I may, perchance, by laughter and jollity, relieve in some degree your souls that are heavy laden with pity for the death of Gismonde. Know then, noble ladies, that there was in Imola a man of evil and corrupt life, Berto della Mazza by name, whose pestilent practices came at length to be so well known to the good folk of Imola that 'twas all one whether he lied or spoke the truth, for there was not a soul in Imola that believed a word he said. Wherefore, seeing that his tricks would pass no longer there, he removed, as in despair, to Venice, that common sink of all abominations, thinking there to find other means than he had found elsewhere to the prosecution of his nefarious designs. And, as if conscience-stricken for his past misdeeds, he assumed an air of the deepest humility, turned the best Catholic of them all, and went and made himself a friar minor, taking the name of Fra Alberto di Imole. With his habit he put on a show of austerity, highly commending penitence and abstinence, and eating or drinking no sort of meat or wine, but such as was to his taste. And scarce a soul was there that wist that the thief, the pimp, the cheat, the assassin, had not been suddenly converted into a great preacher without continuing in the practice of the said iniquities, whensoever the same was privily possible. And withal, having got himself made priest, as often as he celebrated at the altar, he would weep over the passion of our Lord, so there were folk in plenty to see, for tears cost him little enough, when he had a mind to shed them. In short, what with his sermons and his tears, he duped the folk of Venice to such a tune, that scarce a will was there made but he was its executor and depositary. Nay, not a few made him trustee of their moneys, and most, or well nigh most, men and women alike, their confessor and counsellor. In short, he had put off the wolf and put on the shepherd, and the fame of his holiness was such in those parts that St. Francis himself had never the like at Assisi. Now, it so befell that among the ladies that came to confess to this holy friar was one Mona Lisetta of Calquirino, the young, silly, empty-headed wife of a great merchant, who was gone with the galleys to Flanders. Like a Venetian, for unstable are they all, though she placed herself at his feet, she told him but a part of her sins, and when Fra Alberto asked her whether she had a lover, she replied with black looks, "How now, Master Friar? Have you not eyes in your head? See you no difference between my charms and those of other women? Lovers in plenty might I have, so I would, but charms such as mine must not be cheapened. 'Tis not every man that might presume to love me. How many ladies have you seen whose beauty is comparable to mine? I should adorn paradise itself." Whereto she added so much more in praise of her beauty that the friar could scarce hear with patience. Howbeit, discerning at a glance that she was none too well furnished with sense, he deemed the soil meet for his plough, and fell forthwith inordinately in love with her, though he deferred his blandishments to a more convenient season, and by way of supporting his character for holiness began instead to chide her, telling her, among other novelties, that this was vainglory. Whereto the lady retorted that he was a blockhead, and could not distinguish one degree of beauty from another. Wherefore Fra Alberto, lest he should occasion her too much chagrin, cut short the confession and suffered her to depart with the other ladies. Some days later, accompanied by a single trusty friend, he hied him to Mona Lisetta's house, and having withdrawn with her alone into a saloon, where they were safe from observation, he fell on his knees at her feet, and said, "Madam, for the love of God, I crave your pardon of that which I said to you on Sunday, when you spoke to me of your beauty, for so grievously was I chastised therefore that very night, that 'tis but to-day that I have been able to quit my bed." And by whom, quoth my lady, battledore, were you so chastised? I will tell you, returned Fra Alberto. That night I was, as is ever my wont, at my orisons, when suddenly a great light shone in my cell, and before I could turn me to see what it was, I saw standing over me a right goodly youth with a stout cudgel in his hand, who seized me by the habit, and threw me at his feet, and belaboured me till I was bruised from head to foot. And when I asked him why he used me thus, he answered, "'Tis because thou didst to-day presume to speak slightingly of the celestial charms of Monna Lisetta, whom I love next to God himself." Whereupon I asked, "And who are you?" And he made answer that he was the angel Gabriel. Then said I, "O my lord, I pray your pardon me." Wheretofore he answered, "I pardon thee on condition that thou go to her, with what speed thou mayest, and obtain her pardon, which if she accord thee not, I shall come back hither and give thee belabouring enough with my cudgel to make thee a sad man for the rest of thy days." What more he said, I dare not tell you until you first pardon me. Whereat our flimsy, pumpkin-pated Lady Lackbrain was overjoyed, taking all the friar's words for gospel. So after a while she said, "And did I not tell you, Fra Alberto, that my charms were celestial? But so help me God, I am moved to pity of you, and forthwith I pardon you, lest worse should befall you. So only you can tell me what more the angel said." "So will I gladly, madam," returned Fra Alberto, "now that I have your pardon. This only I bid you bear in mind, that you have a care that never a soul in the world hear from you a single word of what I shall say to you. If you would not spoil your good fortune, wherein there is not to-day in the whole world a lady that may compare with you, know then that the angel Gabriel bade me to tell you stands so high in his favour that again and again he would have come to pass the night with you, but that he doubted he should affright you. So now he sends you word through me that he would fain come one night and stay a while with you. And seeing that, being an angel, if he should come visit you in his angelic shape, he might not be touched by you. He would, to pleasure you, present himself in human shape, and so he bids you send him word when you would have him come, and in whose shape, and he will come. For which cause you may deem yourself more blessed than any other lady that lives." My Lady Vanity then said that she was highly flattered to be beloved of the angel Gabriel, whom she herself loved so well that she had never grudged for solely to burn a candle before his picture whenever she saw it, and that he was welcome to visit her as often as he liked, and would always find her alone in her room, on the understanding, however, that he should not desert her for the Virgin Mary, whom she had heard he did mightily affect, and indeed 'twould so appear, for wherever she saw him he was always on his knees at her feet. For the rest, he might even come in what shape he pleased, so that it was not such as to terrify her. Then said Fra Alberto, "Madam, 'tis wisely spoken, and I will arrange it all with him just as you say. But 'tis in your power to do me a great favour, which will cost you nothing, and this favour is that you will be consenting that he visit you in my shape. Now, here wherein you will confer this favour, thus it will be, he will disembody my soul, and set it in paradise, entering himself into my body, and As long as he shall be with you, my soul will be in paradise. Whereto my lady slender wit, so be it, she said. I am well pleased that you have this solace to salve the bruises he gives you on my account. Good, said Fra Alberto, then you will see to it that to-night he find when he comes your outer door unlatched, that he may have ingress for coming as he will in human shape. He will not be able to enter save by the door. It shall be done, replied the lady. Whereupon Fra Alberto took his leave, and the lady remained in such a state of exultation that her nether and knew not her chemise, and it seemed to her 1,000 years until the angel Gabriel should come to visit her. Fra Alberto, bethinking him that 'twas not as an angel but as a cavalier that he must acquit himself that night, fell to fortifying himself with comfits and other dainties, that he might not lose his saddle for a slight cause. Then, leave of absence gotten, he betook him at nightfall with a single companion to the house of a woman that was his friend, which house had served on former occasions as his base when he went chasing the fillies, and having there disguised himself, he hied him, when he deemed 'twas time, to the lady of the house, where, donning the gewgaws he had brought with him, he transformed himself into an angel, and going up, entered the lady's chamber. No sooner saw she this dazzling apparition than she fell on her knees before the angel, who gave her his blessing, raised her to her feet, and motioned her to go to bed. She, nothing loath, obeyed forthwith, and the angel lay down beside his devotee. Now, Fra Alberto was a stout, handsome fellow, whose legs bore themselves right bravely, and being bedded with Mona Lisetta, who was lusty and delicate, he covered her after another fashion than her husband had been wont, and took many a flight that night without wings, so that she heartily cried him content. And not a little therewith did he tell her of the glory celestial. Then, towards daybreak, all being ready for his return, he hied him forth, and repaired, caparisoned as he was, to his friend, whom, lest he should be affrighted, sleeping alone, the good woman of the house had solaced with her company. The lady, so soon as she had breakfasted, betook her to Fra Alberto, and reported the angel Gabriel's visit, and what he had told her of the glory of the life eternal, describing his appearance, not without some added marvels of her own invention. Whereto Fra Alberto replied, Madam, I know not how you fared with him, but this I know, that last night he came to me, and for that I had done his errand with you. He suddenly transported my soul among such a multitude of flowers and roses as was never seen here before, and my soul, what become of my body I know not, tarried in one of the most delightful places that ever was from that hour until matins. As for your body, said the lady, do I not tell you whose it was? It lay all night long with the angel Gabriel in my arms. And if you believe me not, you have but to look under your left pap, where I gave the angel a mighty kiss, of which the mark will last for some days. Why then, said Fra Alberto, I will even to-day, what 'tis long since I did, to wit, undress, that I might see if you say sooth. So they fooled it a long while, and then the lady went home, where Fra Alberto afterwards paid her many a visit without any let. However, one day it so befell that while Mona Lisetta was with one of her gossips canvassing beauties, being minded to exalt her own charms above all others, and having, as we know, none too much wit in her pumpion pat, observed, "Did you but know by whom my charms are prized, then, for sure, you would have naught to say of the rest." Her gossip, all agog to hear, for well she knew her foible, answered, "Madam, it may be as you say, but still, while one knows not who he may be, one cannot alter one's mind so rapidly." Whereupon my Lady Featherbrain, "Gossip," said she, "'tis not for common talk, but he that I wot of is the angel Gabriel, who loves me more dearly than himself. For that I am, so he tells me, the fairest lady in all the world, aye, and in the Marima to boot." Whereat her gossip would fain have laughed, but held herself in, being minded to hear more from her. "Wherefore," she said, "God's faith, madam, if 'tis the angel Gabriel, and he tells you so, why, so of course it must needs be. But I wist not the angels meddled with such matters." "There you erred, gossip," said the lady. "Zounds, he does have it better than my husband, and he tells me they do it above there too. But as he rates my charms above any that are in heaven, he is enamoured of me, and not seldom visits me. So now, dost see?" So away went the gossip, so agog to tell the story that it seemed to her 1,000 years till she was where it might be done. And being met for recreation with a great company of ladies, she narrated it all in detail, whereby it passed to the ladies' husbands, and to other ladies, and from them to yet other ladies, so that in less than 2 days all Venice was full of it. But among others, whose ears it reached, were Monna Lisetta's brothers-in-law, who, keeping their own counsel, refused to find this angel and make out whether he knew how to fly, to which end they kept watch for some nights. Whereof no hint, as it happened, reached Fra Alberto's ears, and so, one night, when he was come to enjoy the lady once more, he was scarce undressed, when her brothers-in-law, who had seen him come, were at the door of the room, and already opening it, when Fra Alberto, hearing the noise and apprehending the danger, started up, and having no other resource, threw open a window that looked on to the Grand Canal, and plunged into the water. The depth was great, and he was an expert swimmer, so that he took no hurt, but, having reached the other bank, found a house open, and forthwith entered it, praying the good man that was within, for God's sake, to save his life, and trumping up a story to account for his being there at so late an hour, and stripped to the skin. The good man took pity on him, and having occasion to go out, he put him in his own bed, bidding him stay there until his return, and so, having locked himself in, he went about his business. Now, when the lady's brothers-in-law entered the room, and found that the angel Gabriel had taken flight, leaving his wings behind him, being balked of their prey, they roundly rated the lady, and then, leaving her disconsolate, betook themselves home with the angel's spoils. Whereby it befell that, when 'twas broad day, the good man, being on the Rialto, heard tell how the angel Gabriel had come to pass the night with Monna Lisetta, and, being surprised by her brothers-in-law, had taken fright, and thrown himself into the canal, and none knew what was become of him. The good man guessed in a trice that the said angel was no other than the man he had at home, whom on his return he recognised, and, after much chaffering, brought him to promise him 50 ducats, that he might not be given to the lady's brothers-in-law. The bargain struck, Fra Alberto signified a desire to be going. Whereupon, "There is no way," said the good man, "but one, if you are minded to take it. To-day we hold a revel, wherein folk lead others about in various disguises. As one man will present a bear, another a wild man, and so forth. And then, in the piazza of San Marco, there is a hunt, which done, the revel is ended, and then away they hie him, whither they will, each with the man he has led about. If you are willing to be led by me in one or another of these disguises, before it can get wind that you are here, I can bring you whither you would go. Otherwise, I see not how you are to quit this place without being known, and the lady's brothers-in-law, reckoning that you must be lurking somewhere in this quarter, have set guards all about to take you." Loath indeed was Fra Alberto to go in such a guise, but such was his fear of the lady's relations that he consented, and told the good man whither he desired to be taken, and that he was content to leave the choice of the disguise to him. The good man then smeared him all over with honey, and covered him with down, set a chain on his neck and a vizard on his face, gave him a stout cudgel to carry in one hand, and 2 huge dogs which he had brought from the shambles to lead with the other, and sent a man to the Rialto to announce that whoso would see the angel Gabriel should hie him to the piazza of San Marco, in by the chain behind, and through a great throng that clamoured, "What manner of thing is this? What manner of thing is this?" He brought him to the piazza, where, what with those that followed them, and those that had come from the Rialto on hearing the announcement, there were folk without end. Arrived at the piazza, he fastened his wild man to a column in a high and exposed place, making as if he were minded to wait till the hunt should begin, whereby the flies and gadflies, attracted by the honey with which he was smeared, caused him most grievous distress. However, the good man waited only until the piazza was thronged, and then, making as if he would unchain his wild man, he tore the vizard from Fra Alberto's face, saying, "Gentlemen, as the boar comes not to the hunt, and the hunt does not take place, that it be not for nothing that you are come hither. I am minded to give you a view of the angel Gabriel, who comes down from heavens to earth by night to solace the ladies of Venice." The vizard was no sooner withdrawn than all recognized Fra Alberto, and greeted him with hootings, rating him in language as offensive and opprobrious as ever rogue was abused withal, and pelting him in the face with every sort of filth that came to hand. In which plight they kept him an exceedingly great while, until by chance the brute thereof reached his brethren, of whom some 6 thereupon put themselves in motion, and, arrived at the piazza, clapped the habit on his back and unchained him, and amid an immense uproar led him off to their convent, where, after languishing a while in prison, 'tis believed that he died. So this man, by reason that, being reputed righteous, he did evil, and 'twas not imputed to him, presumed to counterfeit the angel Gabriel, and, being transformed into a wild man, was in the end put to shame, as he deserved, and vainly bewailed his misdeeds. God grant that so it may betide all his likes.
End of Day 4, the second story.
Day 4, the third story. 3 young men love 3 sisters and flee with them to Crete. The eldest of the sisters slays her lover for jealousy. The second saves the life of the first by yielding herself to the Duke of Crete. Her lover slays her and makes off with the first. The third sister and her lover are charged with murder, are arrested and confess the crime. They escape death by bribing the guards, flee destitute to Rhodes, and there in destitution die.
Pompeian's story ended. Philostrato mused awhile, and then said to her, "A little good matter there was that pleased me at the close of your story, but before it was reached, there was far too much to laugh at, which I could have wished had not been there." Then, turning to Lauretta, he said, "Madame, give us something better to follow, if so it may be." Lauretta replied with a laugh, "Harsh beyond measure are you to the lovers, to desire that their end be always evil. But, as in duty bound, I will tell a story of 3, who all alike came to a bad end, having had little joyance of their loves." And so saying, she began.
Well may ye wot, young ladies, for 'tis abundantly manifest, that there is no vice but most grievous disaster may ensue thereon to him that practises it, and not seldom to others. And of all vices, that which hurries us into peril with loosest rein is, methinks, anger, which is naught but a rash and hasty impulse, prompted by a feeling of pain, which banishes reason, shrouds the eyes of the mind in thick darkness, and sets the soul ablaze with a fierce frenzy. Which, though it not seldom befall men, and one rather than another, has nevertheless been observed to be fraught in women with more disastrous consequences, inasmuch as in them the flame is both more readily kindled, and burns more brightly, and with less impediment to its vehemence. Wherein is no cause to marvel, for if we consider it, we shall see that 'tis of the nature of fire to lay hold more readily of things light and delicate than of matters of firmer and more solid substance. And sure it is that we, without offence to the men be it spoken, are more delicate than they, and much more mobile. Wherefore, seeing how prone we are thereto by nature, and considering also our gentleness and tenderness, how soothing and consolatory they are to the men with whom we consort, and that thus this madness of wrath is fraught with grievous annoy and peril. Therefore, that with stouter heart we may defend ourselves against it, I purpose by my story to show you how the loves of 3 young men and as many ladies, as I said before, were by the anger of one of the ladies changed from a happy to a most woeful complexion. Marseilles, as you know, is situate on the coast of Provence, a city ancient and most famous, and in old time the seat of many more rich men and great merchants than are to be seen there today, among whom was one Narnald Cluada by name, a man of the lowest origin, but a merchant of unsullied probity and integrity, and boundless wealth in lands and goods and money, who had by his lady several children, 3 of them being daughters, older each of them than the other children, who were sons. 2 of the daughters, who were twins, were, when my story begins, 15 years old, and the third was but a year younger, so that in order to their marriage their kinsfolk awaited nothing but the return of Narnald from Spain, whither he was gone with his merchandise. One of the twins was called Ninette, the other Madeleine, the third daughter's name was Berthelle. A young man, Restagnon by name, who, though poor, was of gentle blood, was in the last degree enamoured of Ninette, and she of him, and so discreetly had they managed the affair, that never another soul in the world witting aught of it, they had had joyance of their love, and that for a good while, when it so befell that 2 young friends of theirs, the one Foulque, the other Hugues by name, whom their fathers, recently dead, had left very wealthy, fell in love, the one with Madeleine, the other with Berthelle. Whereof Restagnon, being apprised by Ninette, bethought him that in their love he might find a means to the relief of his necessities. He accordingly consorted freely and familiarly with them, accompanying now one, now the other, and sometimes both of them, when they went to visit their ladies and his. And when he judged that he had made his footing as friendly and familiar as need was, he bade them one day to his house, and said, "Comrades most dear, our friendship, perchance, may not have left you without assurance of the great love I bear you, and that for you I would do even as much as for myself. Wherefore, loving you thus much, I purpose to impart to you that which is in my mind, that in regard thereof you and I together may then resolve in such sort as to you shall seem the best. You, if I may trust your words, as also what I seem to have gathered from your demeanour, by day and night burn with an exceeding great love for the two ladies whom you affect, as I for their sister. For the assuagement whereof, I have good hope that if you will unite with me, I shall find means most sweet and delightsome, to wit, on this wise. You possess, as I do not, great wealth. Now, if you are willing to make of your wealth a common stock with me as third partner therein, and to choose some part of the world where we may live in careless ease upon our substance, without any manner of doubt I trust so to prevail that the three sisters, with great part of their father's substance, shall come to live with us, wherever we shall see fit to go, whereby each with his own lady we shall live as three brethren, the happiest men in the world. 'Tis now for you to determine whether you will embrace this proffered solace, or let it slip from you. The two young men, whose love was beyond all measure fervent, spared themselves the trouble of deliberation. 'Twas enough that they heard that they were to have their ladies, wherefore they answered that, so this should ensue, they were ready to do as he proposed. Having thus their answer, Restagnon, a few days later, was closeted with Ninette, to whom 'twas a matter of no small difficulty for him to get access. Nor had he been long with her before he adverted to what had passed between him and the young men, and thought to commend the project to her, for reasons not a few. Little need, however, had he to urge her, for to live their life openly together was the very thing she desired, far more than he, wherefore she frankly answered that she would have it so, that her sisters would do, more especially in this matter, just as she wished, and that he should lose no time in making all the needful arrangements. So Restagnon returned to the two young men, who were most urgent that it should be done even as he said, and told them that on the part of the ladies the matter was concluded. And so, having fixed upon Crete for their destination, and sold some estates that they had, giving out that they were minded to go a-trading with the proceeds, they converted all else that they possessed into money, and bought a brigantine, which with all secrecy they handsomely equipped, anxiously expecting the time of their departure, while Ninette, on her part, knowing well how her sisters were affected, did so by sweet converse foment their desire, that till it should be accomplished they accounted their life as naught. The night of their embarkation being come, the three sisters opened a great chest that belonged to their father, and took out therefrom a vast quantity of money and jewels, with which they all three issued forth of the house in dead silence, as they had been charged, and found there three lovers awaiting them, who, having forthwith brought them aboard the brigantine, bade the rowers give way, and tarrying nowhere, arrived the next evening at Genoa, where the new lovers had for the first time joyance and solace of their love. Having taken what they needed of refreshment, they resumed their course, touching at this port and that, and in less than 8 days, speeding without impediment, were come to Crete. There they bought them domains both beautiful and broad, whereon, hard by Candia, they built them mansions most goodly and delightsome, wherein they lived as barons, keeping a crowd of retainers with dogs, hawks, and horses, and speeding the time with their ladies in feasting and revelling and merrymaking, none so light-hearted as they. Such being the tenor of their life, it so befell that, as 'tis matter of daily experience, that however delightful a thing may be, superabundance thereof will breed disgust, Restagnon, much as he had loved Ninette, being now able to have his joyance of her without stint or restraint, began to weary of her, and by consequence to abate somewhat of his love for her. And being mightily pleased with a fair gentlewoman of the country, whom he met at a merrymaking, he set his heart upon her, and began to show himself marvellously courteous and gallant towards her. Which Ninette perceiving, grew so jealous, that he might not go a step but she knew of it, and resented it to his torment and her own with high words. But as, while superfluity engenders disgust, appetite is but whetted when fruit is forbidden, So Ninette's wrath added fuel to the flame of Restagnon's new love. And whichever was the event, whether in course of time Restagnon had the lady's favour or had it not, Ninette, whoever may have brought her the tidings, firmly believed that he had it, whereby from the depths of distress she passed into a towering passion, and thus was transported into such a frenzy of rage that all the love she bore to Restagnon was converted into bitter hatred, and, blinded by her wrath, she made up her mind to avenge by Restagnon's death the dishonour which she deemed that he had done her. So she had recourse to an old Greek woman that was very skilful in compounding poisons, whom by promises and gifts she induced to distil a deadly water, which, keeping her own counsel, she herself gave Restagnon to drink one evening, when he was somewhat heated and quite off his guard, whereby, such was the efficacy of the water, she dispatched Restagnon before matins. On learning of his death, Foulques and Hugues and their ladies, who knew not that he had been poisoned, united their bitter with Ninette's feigned lamentations, and gave him honourable sepulture. But so it befell that not many days after, the old woman that had compounded the poison for Ninette was taken for another crime, and, being put to the torture, confessed the compounding of the poison among other of her misdeeds, and fully declared what had thereby come to pass. Wherefore the Duke of Crete, breathing no word of his intent, came privily by night, and set a guard around Foulques's palace where Ninette then was, and quietly and quite unopposed took and carried her off, and without putting her to torture learned from her in a trice all that he sought to know touching the death of Restagnon. Foulques and Hugues had learned privily of the Duke, and their ladies of them, for what cause Ninette was taken, and being mightily distressed thereby, bestirred themselves with all zeal to save Ninette from the fire to which they apprehended she would be condemned, as having indeed richly deserved it. But all their endeavours seemed to avail nothing, for the Duke was unwaveringly resolved that justice should be done. Madeleine, Foulques's fair wife, who had long been courted by the Duke, but had never deigned to show him the least favour, thinking that by yielding herself to his will she might redeem her sister from the fire, dispatched a trusty envoy to him with the intimation that she was entirely at his disposal, upon the twofold condition that in the first place her sister should be restored to her free and scatheless, and in the second place the affair should be kept secret. Albeit gratified by this overture, the Duke was long in doubt whether he should accept it. In the end, however, he made up his mind to do so, and signified his approval to the envoy. Then, with the lady's consent, he put Foulques and Hugues under arrest for a night, as if he were minded to examine them of the affair, and meanwhile courted himself privily with Madeleine. Ninette, who he had made believe had been set in a sack and was to be sunk in the sea that same night, he took with him, and presented her to her sister in requital of the night's joyance, which, as he parted from her on the morrow, he prayed her might not be the last, as it was the first fruit of their love, at the same time enjoining her to send the guilty lady away, that she might not bring reproach upon him, nor he be compelled to deal rigorously with her again. Released the same morning, and told that Ninette had been cast into the sea, Foulques and Hugues, fully believing that so it was, came home, thinking how they should console their ladies for the death of their sister. But, though Madeleine was at great pains to conceal Ninette, Foulques, nevertheless, to his no small amazement, discovered that she was there, which at once excited his suspicion, for he knew that the Duke had been enamoured of Madeleine, and he asked her how it was that Ninette was there. Madeleine made up a long story by way of explanation, to which his sagacity gave little credit, and in the end, after long parley, he constrained her to tell the truth. Whereupon, overcome with grief and transported with rage, he drew his sword, and, deaf to her appeal for mercy, slew her. Then, fearing the vengeful justice of the Duke, he left the dead body in the room, and hied him to Ninette, and with a counterfeit gladsome mien said to her, "Go we without delay whither thy sister has appointed that I escort thee, that thou fall not again into the hands of the Duke." Ninette believed him, and being fain to go for very fear, she forwent further leave taking of her sister, more particularly as it was now night, and set out with Fulk, who took with him such little money as he could lay his hands upon, and so they made their way to the coast, where they got aboard a bark, but none ever knew where their voyage ended. Madeleine's dead body being discovered next day, certain evil-disposed folk, that bore a grudge to Hugues, forthwith apprised the Duke of the fact, which brought the Duke, for much he loved Madeleine, in hot haste to the house, where he arrested Hugues and his lady, who as yet knew nothing of the departure of Fulk and Ninette, and extorted from them a confession that they and Fulk were jointly answerable for Madeleine's death. For which cause, being justly apprehensive of death, they with great address corrupted the guards that had charge of them, giving them a sum of money which they kept concealed in their house against occasions of need, and together with the guards fled with all speed, leaving all that they possessed behind them, and took ship by night for Rhodes, where, being arrived, they lived in great poverty and misery no long time. Such then was the issue to which Restagnon by his foolish love, and Ninette by her wrath, brought themselves and others. End of Day 4, the Third Story.
Day 4, the Fourth Story. Gerbino, in breach of the plighted faith of his grandfather, King Guglielmo, attacks a ship of the King of Tunis to defend his daughter. She being slain by those aboard the ship, he slays them, and afterwards he is beheaded.
Lauretta, her story ended, kept silence, and the king brooded as in deep thought, while one or another of the company deplored the sad fate of this or the other of the lovers, or censured Ninette's wrath, or made some other comment. At length, however, the king roused himself, and raising his head, made sign to Elisa that was now for her to speak. So modestly Elisa thus began.
Gracious ladies, not a few there are that believe that love loses no shafts save when he is kindled by the eyes, contemning their opinion that hold that passion may be engendered by words, whose error will be abundantly manifest in a story which I purpose to tell you, wherein you may see how mere rumor not only wrought mutual love in those that had never seen one another, but also brought both to a miserable death. Guglielmo the second, as the Sicilians compute, King of Sicily, had 2 children, a son named Ruggeri and a daughter named Costanza. Ruggeri died before his father, and left a son named Gerbino, who, being carefully trained by his grandfather, grew up a most goodly gallant, and of great renown in court and camp, and that not only within the borders of Sicily, but in divers other parts of the world, among them Barbary, then tributary to the King of Sicily. And among others, to whose ears was wafted the bruit of Gerbino's magnificent prowess and courtesy, was a daughter of the King of Tunis, who, by averment of all that had seen her, was a creature as fair and debonair, and of as great and noble a spirit as nature ever formed. To hear tell of brave men was her delight, and what she heard, now from one, now from another, of the brave deeds of Gerbino, she treasured him in her mind so sedulously, and pondered them with such pleasure, rehearsing them to herself in imagination, that she became hotly enamored of him, and there was none of whom she talked, or heard others talk, so gladly. Nor, on the other hand, had the fame of her incomparable beauty and other excellences failed to travel, as to other lands, so also to Sicily, where, falling on Gerbino's ears, it gave him no small delight, to such effect that he burned for the lady no less vehemently than she for him. Wherefore, until such time as he might, upon some worthy occasion, have his grandfather's leave to go to Tunis, yearning beyond measure to see her, he charged every friend of his that went thither to give her to know, as best he might, his great and secret love for her, and to bring him tidings of her; which office one of the said friends discharged with no small address, for, having obtained access to her, after the manner of merchants, by bringing jewels for her to look at, he fully apprised her of Zerbino's passion, and placed him and all that he possessed entirely at her disposal. The lady received both messenger and message with gladsome mien, made answer that she loved with equal ardour, and in token thereof sent Zerbino one of her most precious jewels. Zerbino received the jewel with extreme delight, and sent her many a letter and many a most precious gift by the hand of the same messenger, and 'twas well understood between them that, should fortune accord him opportunity, he should see and know her. Of this footing the affair remained somewhat longer than was expedient, and so, while Zerbino and the lady burned with mutual love, it befell that the king of Tunis gave her in marriage to the king of Granada, whereat she was wroth beyond measure, for that she was not only going into a country remote from her lover, but, as she deemed, was severed from him altogether; and so this might not come to pass, gladly, could she but have seen how, would she have left her father and fled to Zerbino. In like manner Zerbino, on learning of the marriage, was vexed beyond measure, and was ofttimes minded, could he but find means to win to her husband by sea, to wrest her from him by force. Some rumour of Zerbino's love and of his intent reached the king of Tunis, who, knowing his prowess and power, took alarm, and as the time drew nigh for conveying the lady to Granada, sent word of his purpose to King Guglielmo, and craved his assurance that it might be carried into effect without let or hindrance on the part of Zerbino or anyone else. The old king had heard nothing of Zerbino's love affair, and never dreaming that 'twas on such account that the assurance was craved, granted it without demur, and in pledge thereof sent the king of Tunis his glove; which received, the king made ready a great and goodly ship in the port of Carthage, and equipped her with all things meet for those that were to man her, and with all appointments apt and seemly for the reception of his daughter, and awaited only fair weather to send her therein to Granada. All which the young lady seeing and marking, sent one of her servants privily to Palermo, bidding him greet the illustrious Zerbino on her part, and tell him that a few days would see her on her way to Granada; wherefore 'twould now appear whether or no he were really as doughty a man as he was reputed, and loved her as much as he had so often protested. The servant did not fail to deliver her message exactly, and returned to Tunis, leaving Zerbino, who knew that his grandfather King Guglielmo had given the king of Tunis the desired assurance, at a loss how to act. But prompted by love, and goaded by the lady's words, and loath to seem a craven, he hied him to Messina, and having there armed 2 light galleys, and manned them with good men and true, he put to sea and stood for Sardinia, deeming that the lady's ship must pass that way. Nor was he far out in his reckoning, for he had not been there many days when the ship sped by a light breeze, hove in sight not far from the place where he lay in wait for her. Whereupon Zerbino said to his comrades, "Gentlemen, if you be as good men and true as I deem you, there is none of you but must have felt, if he feel not now, the might of love. For without love I deem no mortal capable of true worth or aught that is good, and if you are or have been in love, 'twill be easy for you to understand that which I desire. I love, and 'tis because I love that I have laid this travail upon you. and that which I love is in the ship that you see before you, which is fraught not only with my beloved, but with immense treasures, which, if you are good men and true, we, so we but play the man in fight, may with little trouble make our own. Nor for my share of the spoils of the victory demand I aught but a lady, whose love it is that prompts me to take arms. All else I freely cede to you from this very hour. Forward then! Attack we this ship, success should be ours, for God favours our enterprise, nor lends her wind to evade us." Fewer words might have sufficed the illustrious Zerbino, for the rapacious Messenices that were with him were already bent heart and soul upon that to which by his harangue he sought to animate them. So when he was done, they raised a mighty shout, so that 'twas as if trumpets did blare, and cut up their arms, and smiting the water with their oars, overhauled the ship. The advancing galleys were observed while they were yet a great way off by the ship's crew, who, not being able to avoid the combat, put themselves in a posture of defense. Arrived at close quarters, the illustrious Zerbino bade send the ship's masters aboard the galleys, unless they were minded to do battle. Certified of the challenge, and who they were that made it, the Saracens answered that 'twas in breach of the faith plighted to them by their assailant's king that they were thus attacked, and in token thereof displayed King Guglielmo's glove, averring in set terms that there should be no surrender either of themselves or of aught that was aboard the ship without battle. Zerbino, who had observed the lady standing on the ship's poop, and seen that she was far more beautiful than he had imagined, burned with a yet fiercer flame than before, and to the display of the glove made answer that, as he had no falcons there just then, the glove booted him not; wherefore, so they were not minded to surrender the lady, let them prepare to receive battle. Whereupon, without further delay, the battle began on both sides with a furious discharge of arrows and stones, on which wise it was long protracted to their common loss, until at last Zerbino, seeing that he gained little advantage, took a light bark which they had brought from Sardinia, and having fired her, bore down with her, and both the galleys, upon the ship. Whereupon the Saracens, seeing that they must perforce surrender their ship or die, caused the king's daughter, who lay beneath the deck weeping, to come up on deck, and led her to the prow, and shouting to Zerbino, while the lady shrieked alternately mercy and succor, opened her veins before his eyes, and cast her into the sea, saying, "Take her, we give her to thee on such wise as we can, and as thy faith has merited." Maddened to witness this deed of barbarism, Zerbino, as if courting death, recked no more of the arrows and the stones, but drew alongside the ship, and, despite the resistance of her crew, boarded her, and as a famished lion ravens amongst a herd of oxen, and tearing and rending, now one, now another, gluts his wrath before he appears his hunger, so Zerbino, sword in hand, hacking and hewing on all sides among the Saracens, did ruthlessly slaughter not a few of them, till, as the burning ship began to blaze more fiercely, he bade the seamen take thereout all that they might by way of guerdon, which done, he quitted her, having gained but a rueful victory over his adversaries. His next care was to recover from the sea the body of the fair lady, whom long and with many a tear he mourned. And so he returned to Sicily, and gave the body honorable sepulture in Ustica, an islet that faces, as it were, Trapani, and went home the saddest man alive. When these tidings reached the king of Tunis, he sent to King Guglielmo ambassadors, habited in black, who made complaint of the breach of faith, and recited the manner of its occurrence, which caused King Guglielmo no small chagrin, and seeing not how he might refuse the justice they demanded, he had Zerbino arrested, and he himself, none of his barons being able by any entreaty to turn him from his purpose, sentenced him to forfeit his head, and had it severed from his body in his presence, preferring to suffer the loss of his only grandson than to gain the reputation of a faithless king. And so miserably, within the compass of a few brief days, died the two lovers by woeful deaths, as I have told you, and without having known any joyance of their love. End of Day 4, the Fourth Story.
Day 4, the Fifth Story. Lisabetta's brothers slay her lover. He appears to her in a dream, and shows her where he is buried. She privately disinters the head, and sets it in a pot of basil, whereupon she daily weeps a great while. The pot being taken from her by her brothers, she dies not long after.
Elisa's story ended, the king bestowed a few words of praise upon it, and then laid the burden of discourse upon Philomela, who, full of compassion for the woes of Zerbino and his lady, heaved a piteous sigh, and thus began.
My story, gracious ladies, will not be of folk of so high a rank as those of whom Elisa has told us, but perchance 'twill not be less touching. 'Tis brought to my mind by the recent mention of Messina, where the matter befell. Know then that there were at Messina 3 young men, that were brothers and merchants, who were left very rich on the death of their father, who was of San Gimignano, and they had a sister, Lisabetta by name, a girl fair enough and no less debonair, but whom, for some reason or another, they had not as yet bestowed in marriage. The 3 brothers had also in their shop a young paysan, Lorenzo by name, who managed all their affairs, and who was so goodly of person and gallant that Lisabetta bestowed many a glance upon him, and began to regard him with extraordinary favour, which Lorenzo, marking from time to time, gave up all his other amours, and in like manner began to affect her, and so, their loves being equal, 'twas not long before they took heart of grace, and did that which each most desired, wherein, continuing to their no small mutual solace and delight, they neglected to order it with due secrecy, whereby one night, as Lisabetta was going to Lorenzo's room, she, all unwittingly, was observed by the eldest of the brothers, who, albeit much distressed by what he had learned, yet, being a young man of discretion, was swayed by considerations more seemly, and, allowing no word to escape, spent the night in turning the affair over in his mind in divers ways. On the morning he told his brothers that which, touching Lisabetta and Lorenzo, he had observed in the night, which, that no shame might thence ensue either to them or to their sister, they after long consultation determined to pass over in silence, making as if they had seen or heard naught thereof, until such time as they in a safe and convenient manner might banish this disgrace from their sight before it could go further. Adhering to which purpose, they jested and laughed with Lorenzo, as they had been wont, and after a while, pretending that they were all 3 going forth of the city on pleasure, they took Lorenzo with them, and being come to a remote and very lonely spot, seeing that 'twas apt for their design, they took Lorenzo, who was completely off his guard, and slew him, and buried him on such wise that none was ware of it. On their return to Messina, they gave out that they had sent him away on business, which was readily believed, because 'twas what they had been frequently used to do. But as Lorenzo did not return, and Lisabetta questioned the brothers about him with great frequency and urgency, being sorely grieved by his long absence, it so befell that one day, when she was very pressing in their enquiries, one of the brothers said, "What means this? What means this? What hast thou to do with Lorenzo, that thou shouldst ask about him so often? Ask us no more, or we will give thee such answer as thou deservest." So the girl, sick at heart and sorrowful, fearing she knew not what, asked no questions, but many a time at night she called piteously to him, and besought him to come to her, and bewailed his long tarrying with many a tear, and ever yearning for his return, languished in total dejection. But so it was, that one night, when, after long weeping that her Lorenzo came not back, she had at last fallen asleep, Lorenzo appeared to her in a dream, wan and in utter disarray, his clothes torn to shreds and sodden, and thus, as she thought, he spoke: "Lisabetta, thou dost not but call me, and vex thyself for my long tarrying, and bitterly upbraid me with thy tears, wherefore be it known to thee that return to thee I may not, because the last day that thou didst see me, thy brother slew me." After which he described the place where they had buried him, told her to call and expect him no more, and vanished. The girl then awoke, and doubting not that the vision was true, wept bitterly, and when morning came, and she was risen, not daring to say aught to her brothers, she resolved to go to the place indicated in the vision, and see if what she had dreamed were even as it appeared to her. So, having leave to go a little way out of the city for recreation in company of a maid that had at one time lived with them and knew all that she did, she hied her thither with all speed, and having removed the dry leaves that were strewn about the place, she began to dig where the earth seemed least hard. Nor had she dug long before she found the body of her hapless lover, whereon as yet there was no trace of corruption or decay, and thus she saw without any manner of doubt that her vision was true. And so, saddest of women, knowing that she might not bewail him there, she would gladly, if she could, have carried away the body and given it more honourable sepulture elsewhere. But as she might not do so, she took a knife, and, as best she could, severed the head from the trunk, and wrapped it in a napkin, and laid it in the lap of her maid, and having covered the rest of the corpse with earth, she left the spot, having been seen by none, and went home. There she shut herself up in her room with the head, and kissed it 1,000 times in every part, and wept long and bitterly over it, till she had bathed it in her tears. She then wrapped it in a piece of fine cloth, and set it in a large and beautiful pot of the sort in which marjoram or basil is planted, and covered it with earth, and therein planted some roots of the goodliest basil of Salerno, and drenched them only with her tears, or water perfumed with roses or orange blossoms. And 'twas her wont ever to sit beside this pot, and all her soul one yearning, to pour upon it, as that which enshrined her Lorenzo, and when long time she had so done, she would bend over it, and weep a great while, until the basil was quite bathed in her tears. Fostered with such constant unremitting care, and nourished by the richness given to the soil by the decaying head that lay therein, the basil burgeoned out in exceeding great beauty and fragrance. And the girl persevering ever in this way of life, the neighbours from time to time took note of it, and when her brothers marvelled to see her beauty ruined, and her eyes as it were evanished from her head, they told them of it, saying, "We have observed that such is her daily wont." Whereupon the brothers, marking her behaviour, chid her therefore once or twice, and as she heeded them not, caused the pot to be taken privily from her, which, so soon as she missed it, she demanded with the utmost instance and insistence, and, as they gave it not back to her, ceased not to wail and weep, insomuch as she fell sick, nor in her sickness craved she aught but the pot of basil. Whereat the young men, marvelling mightily, resolved to see what the pot might contain, and having removed the earth, they espied the cloth, and therein the head, which was not yet so decayed, but that by the curled locks they knew it for Lorenzo's head. Passing strange they found it, and fearing lest it should be bruited abroad, they buried the head, and, with as little said as might be, took order of their privy departure from Messina, and hied them thence to Naples. The girl ceased not to weep and crave her pot, and so weeping died. Such was the end of her disastrous love, but not a few in course of time coming to know the truth of the affair, There was one that made the song that is still sung, to wit: A thief he was, I swear, a sorry Christian he, that took my Basil of Salerno fair, etc. End of Day 4, the Fifth Story.
Day 4, the Sixth Story of the Decameron. Andreula loves Gabriotto. She tells him a dream that she has had. He tells her a dream of his own, and dies suddenly in her arms. While she and her Maya are carrying his corpse to his house, they are taken by the Signory. She tells how the matter stands, is threatened with violence by the Podestà, but will not brook it. Her father hears how she is bested, and her innocence being established, causes her to be set at large. But she, being minded to tarry no longer in the world, becomes a nun.
Glad indeed were the ladies to have heard Philomena's story, for that, often though they had heard the song sung, they had never yet, for all their inquiries, been able to learn the occasion upon which it was made. Where it was ended, Pamphilo received the king's command to follow suit, and thus spoke.
By the dream told in the foregoing story, I am prompted to relate one in which two dreams are told, dreams of that which was to come, as Lisabetta's was of that which had been, and which were both fulfilled almost as soon as they were told by those that had dreamed them. Wherefore, loving ladies, you must know that 'tis the common experience of mankind to have diverse visions during sleep, and albeit the sleeper, while he sleeps, deems all alike most true, but being awake, judges some of them to be true, others to be probable, and others again to be quite devoid of truth. Yet not a few are found to have come to pass. For which cause many are as sure of every dream as of aught that they see in their waking hours, and so, as their dreams engender in them fear or hope, or sorrowful or joyous. And on the other hand, there are those that credit no dream, until they see themselves fallen into the very peril whereof they were forewarned. Of whom I approve neither sort, for in sooth neither are all dreams true, nor all alike false. That they are not all true, there is none of us but may many a time have proved, and that they are not all alike false has already been shown in Philomena's story, and shall also, as I said before, be shown in mine. Wherefore I deem that in a virtuous course of life and conduct there is no need to fear aught by reason of any dream that is contrary thereto, or on that account to give up any just design. And as for crooked and sinister enterprises, however dreams may seem to favour them, and flatter the hopes of the dreamer with auspicious omens, none should trust them. Rather should all give full credence to such as run counter thereto. But come we to the story. In the city of Brescia there lived of yore a gentleman named Messer Negro da Ponte Carraro, who, with other children, had a very fair daughter, Andreola by name, who, being unmarried, chanced to fall in love with a neighbour, one Gabriotto, a man of low degree, but goodly of person and debonair, and endowed with all admirable qualities. And, aided and abetted by the housemaid, the girl not only brought it to pass that Gabriotto knew that he was beloved of her, but that many a time, to their mutual delight, he came to see her in a fair garden belonging to her father, and that naught but death might avail to sever them from this their gladsome love, they became privily man and wife. And while thus they continued their clandestine intercourse, it happened that one night, while the girl slept, she saw herself in a dream in her garden with Gabriotto, who, to the exceeding great delight of both, held her in his arms. And while thus they lay, she saw issue from his body, somewhat dark and frightful, the shape whereof she might not discern, which, as she thought, laid hold of Gabriotto, and in her despite with prodigious force reft him from her embrace, and bore him with it underground, so that both were lost to her sight for evermore. Whereby, stricken with sore and inexpressible grief, she awoke, and albeit she was overjoyed to find that 'twas not as she had dreamed, yet a haunting dread of what she had seen in her vision entered her soul. Wherefore, Gabriotto being minded to visit her on the ensuing night, she did her best endeavour to dissuade him from coming, but seeing that he was bent upon it, lest he should suspect somewhat, she received him in her garden, where, having culled roses many, white and red, for 'twas summer, she sat herself down with him at the base of a most fair and lucent fountain. There long and joyously they dallied, and then Gabriotto asked her wherefore she had that day forbade his coming. Whereupon the lady told him her dream of the night before, and the doubt and fear which it had engendered in her mind. Whereat Gabriotto laughed, and said that 'twas the height of folly to put any faith in dreams, for that they were occasioned by too much or too little food, and were daily seen to be, one and all, things of naught. Adding, were I minded to give heed to dreams, I should not be here now, for I too had a dream last night, which was on this wise. Methought I was in a fair and pleasant wood, and there, a-hunting, caught a she-goat as beautiful and lovable as any that ever was seen, and, as it seemed to me, whiter than snow, which in a little while grew so tame and friendly that she never stirred from my side. All the same, so jealous was I lest she should leave me, that, meseemed, I had set a collar of gold around her neck, and held her by a golden chain. And presently meseemed that, while the she-goat lay at rest with her head in my lap, there came forth, I know not whence, a greyhound bitch, black as coal, famished, and most fearsome to look upon, which made straight for me, and for, meseemed, I offered no resistance, set her muzzle to my breast on the left side, and gnawed through to the heart, which, meseemed, she tore out to carry away with her. Whereupon ensued so sore a pain that it brake my sleep, and as I awoke, I laid my hand to my side to feel if aught were amiss there. But finding nothing, I laughed at myself that I had searched. But what signifies it all? Visions of the like sort, ay, and far more appalling, have I had plenty, and naught whatever, great or small, has come of any of them. So let it pass, and think we how we may speed the time merrily. What she heard immensely enhanced the already great dread which her own dream had inspired in the girl, but, not to vex Gabriotto, she dissembled her terror as best she might. But though she made great cheer, embracing and kissing him, and receiving his embraces and kisses, yet she felt a doubt, she knew not why, and many a time, more than her wont, she would gaze upon his face, and ever and anon her glance would stray through the garden to see if any black creature were coming from any quarter. While thus they passed the time, of a sudden Gabriotto heaved a great sigh, and embracing her said, Alas, my soul, thy succour, for I die. And so saying, he fell down upon the grassy mead. Whereupon the girl drew him to her, and laid him on her lap, and all but wept, and said, O sweet my lord, what is it that ails thee? But Gabriotto was silent, and gasping sore for breath, and bathed in sweat, in no long time departed this life. How grievous was the distress of the girl who loved him more than herself, you, my ladies, may well imagine. With many a tear she mourned him, and many times she vainly called him by his name. But when, having felt his body all over, and found it cold in every part, she could no longer doubt that he was dead, knowing not what to say or do, she went, tearful and woebegone, to call the maid to whom she had confided her love, and showed her the woeful calamity that had befallen her. Piteously awhile they wept together over the dead face of Gabriotto, and then the girl said to the maid, Now that God has reft him from me, I have no mind to linger in this life. But before I slay myself, I would we might find apt means to preserve my honour and the secret of our love, and to bury the body from which the sweet soul has fled." "My daughter," said the maid, "speak not of slaying thyself, for so wouldst thou lose in the other world also him that thou hast lost here, seeing that thou wouldst go to hell, whither, sure I am, his soul is not gone, for a good youth he was. Far better were it to put on a cheerful courage, and bethink thee to succour his soul with thy prayers or pious works, if perchance he have need thereof by reason of any sin that he may have committed. We can bury him readily enough in this garden, nor will anyone ever know, for none knows that we ever came hither, and if thou wilt not have it so, we can bear him forth of the garden, and leave him there, and on the morrow he will be found, and carried home, and buried by his kinsfolk." The girl, heavy laden though she was with anguish, and still weeping, yet gave ear to the counsels of her maid, and rejecting the former alternative, made answer to the latter on this wise: "Now God forbid that a youth so dear, whom I have so loved and made my husband, should with my consent be buried like a dog, or left out there in the street. He has had my tears, and so far as I may avail, he shall have the tears of his kinsfolk, and already wot I what we must do." And forthwith she sent the maid for a piece of silken cloth, which she had in one of her boxes, and when the maid returned with it, they spread it on the ground, and laid Gabriotto's body thereon, resting the head upon a pillow. She then closed the eyes and mouth, shedding the while many a tear, wove for him a wreath of roses, and strewed upon him all the roses that he and she had gathered. Which done, she said to the maid, "'Tis but a short way hence to the door of his house, so thither we will bear him, thou and I, thus as we might have dight him, and will lay him at the door. Day will soon dawn, and they will take him up, and, though 'twill be no consolation to them, I, in whose arms he died, shall be glad of it." So saying, she burst once more into a torrent of tears, and fell with her face upon the face of the dead, and so long time she wept. Then, yielding at last to the urgency of her maid, for day was drawing nigh, she arose, drew from her finger the ring with which she had been wedded to Gabriotto, and set it on his finger, saying with tears, "Dear my lord, if thy soul be witness of my tears, or if, when the spirit is fled, aught of intelligence or sense shall lurk in the body, graciously receive the last gift of her whom in life thou didst so dearly love." Which said, she swooned, and fell upon the corpse. But, coming after a while to herself, she arose, and then she and her maid took the cloth whereon the body lay, and so burying it, quitted the garden, and bent their steps towards the dead man's house. As thus they went, it chanced that certain of the podesta's guard, that for some reason or other were abroad at that hour, met them, and arrested them with the corpse. Andriola, to whom death was more welcome than life, no sooner knew them for the officers of the Signory, and she frankly said, "I know you, who you are, and that flight would avail me nothing. I am ready to come with you before the Signory, and to tell all there is to tell. But let none of you presume to touch me, so long as I obey you, or to take away aught that is on this body, if he would not that I accuse him." And so, none venturing to lay hand upon either her person or the corpse, she entered the palace. As soon as the podesta was apprised of the affair, he arose, had her brought into his room, and there made himself conversant with the circumstances. And certain physicians being charged to inquire whether the good man had met his death by poison or otherwise, all with one accord averred that 'twas not by poison, but that he was choked by the bursting of an imposthume near the heart. Which, when the podesta heard, perceiving that the girl's guilt could be but slight, he sought to make a pretence of giving what it was not lawful for him to sell her, and told her that he would set her at liberty, so she were consenting to pleasure him. But finding that he did but waste his words, he cast aside all decency, and would have used force. Whereupon Andreola, kindling with scorn, waxed exceeding brave, and defended herself with a virile energy, and with high and contumelious words drove him from her. When 'twas broad day, the affair reached the ears of Messer Negro, who, half dead with grief, hied him with not a few of his friends to the palace, where, having heard all that Podesta had to say, he required him peremptorily to give him back his daughter. The Podesta, being minded rather to be his own accuser, than that he should be accused by the girl of the violence that he had meditated towards her, began by praising her and her constancy, and in proof thereof went on to tell what he had done. He ended by saying that, marking her admirable firmness, he had fallen mightily in love with her, and so, notwithstanding she had been wedded to a man of low degree, he would, if 'twere agreeable to her and to her father, Messer Negro, gladly make her his wife. While they thus spoke, Andreola made her appearance, and, weeping, threw herself at her father's feet, saying, "My father, I wot I need not tell you the story of my presumption and the calamity that has befallen me, for sure I am that you have heard it and know it. Wherefore, with all possible humility, I crave your pardon of my fault, to wit, that without your knowledge I took for my husband him that pleased me best. And this I crave, not that my life may be spared, but that I may die as your daughter, and not as your enemy." And so, weeping, she fell at his feet. Messer Negro, now an old man, and naturally kindly and affectionate, heard her not without tears, and, weeping, raised her tenderly to her feet, saying, "Daughter mine, I had much liefer had it that thou hadst had a husband that I deemed a match for thee, and in that thou hadst taken one that pleased thee, I too had been pleased. But thy concealing thy choice from me is grievous to me, by reason of my distrust of me, and yet more so, seeing that thou hast lost him before I have known him. But as 'tis even so, to his remains be paid the honour which, while he lived for thy contentment, I had gladly done him as my son-in-law." Then, turning to his sons and kinsmen, he bade them order Gabriotto's obsequies with all pomp and honourable circumstance. Meanwhile, the young man's kinsmen and kinswomen, having heard the news, had flocked thither, bringing with them almost all the rest of the folk, men and women alike, that were in the city. And so his body, resting on Andreola's cloth, and covered with her roses, was laid out in the middle of the courtyard, and there was mourned, not by her and his kinfolk alone, but publicly, by well nigh all the women of the city, and not a few men, and shouldered by some of the noblest of the citizens, as it had been the remains of no plebeian but of a noble, was borne from the public yard to the tomb with exceeding great pomp. Some days afterwards, as the podesta continued to urge his suit, Messer Negro would have discussed the matter with his daughter, but, as she would hear none of it, and he was minded in this matter to defer to her wishes, she and her maid entered a religious house of great repute for sanctity, where in just esteem they lived long time thereafter. End of Day 4, the 6th Story.
Day 4, the 7th Story. Simone loves Pasquino. They are together in a garden. Pasquino rubs a leaf of sage against his teeth and dies. Simona is arrested, and, with intent to show the judge how Pasquino died, rubs one of the leaves of the same plant against her teeth, and likewise dies.
When Pamphilo had done with his story, the king, betraying no compassion for Androla, glancing at Emilia, signified to her his desire that she should now continue the sequence of narration. Emilia made no demur, and thus began.
Dear gossips, Pamphilo's story puts me upon telling you another, in no wise like thereto, save in this, that as Andriola lost her lover in a garden, so also did she of whom I am to speak, and, being arrested like Andriola, did also deliver herself from the court, albeit 'twas not by any vigour or firmness of mind, but by a sudden death. And as 'twas said among us a while ago, albeit love affects the mansions of the noble, he does not, therefore, disdain the dominion of the dwellings of the poor, nay, does there at times give proof of his might no less signal than when he makes him feared of the wealthiest as a most potent lord. Which, though not fully, will in some degree appear in my story, wherewith I am minded to return to our city, from which today's discourse, roving from matter to matter, and one part of the world to another, has carried us so far. Know then that no great while ago there dwelt in Florence a maid most fair, and for her rank debonair, she was but a poor man's daughter, whose name was Simona, and though she must needs win with her own hands the bread she ate, and maintain herself by spinning wool, yet was she not therefore of so poor a spirit but that she dared to give harbourage in her mind to Love, who for some time had sought to gain entrance there by means of the gracious deeds and words of a young man of her own order that went about distributing wool to spin for his master, a woolmonger. Love being thus, with a pleasant image of her beloved Pasquino, admitted into her soul, mightily did she yearn, albeit she hazarded no advance, and heaved 1,000 sighs fiercer than fire with every skein of yarn that she wound upon her spindle, while she called to mind who he was that had given her that wool to spin. Pasquino on his part became, meanwhile, very anxious that his master's wool should be well spun, and most particularly about that which Simona span, as if, indeed, it and it alone was to furnish forth the whole of the cloth. And so, what with the anxiety which the one evinced, and the gratification that it afforded to the other, it befell that, the one waxing unusually bold, and the other casting off not a little of her wonted shyness and reserve, they came to an understanding for their mutual solace, which proved so delightful to both that neither waited to be bidden by the other, but was rather which should be the first to make the overture. While thus they spent their days in an even tenor of delight, and ever grew more ardently enamoured of one another, Pasquino chanced to say to Simona that he wished of all things she would contrive how she might betake her to a garden, whither he would bring her, that there they might be more at their ease, and in greater security. Simona said that she was agreeable, and, having given her father to understand that she was minded to go to San Gallo for the pardoning, she hied her with one of her gossips, Luigina by name, to the garden of which Pasquino had told her. Here she found Pasquino awaiting her with a friend, one Puccino, otherwise Stramba. And Stramba and Luigina falling at once to love-making, Pasquino and Simona left a part of the garden to them, and withdrew to another part for their own solace. Now there was in their part of the garden a very fine and lovely sage-bush, at foot of which they sat them down and made merry together a great while, and talked much of a junketing they meant to have in the garden quite at their ease. By and by Pasquino, turning to the great sage-bush, plucked therefrom a leaf, and fell to rubbing his teeth and gums therewith, saying that sage was an excellent detergent of aught that remained upon them after a meal. Having done so, he returned to the topic of the junketing of which he had spoken before. But he had not pursued it far before his countenance entirely changed, and forthwith he lost sight and speech, and shortly after died. Whereupon Simona fell a-weeping and shrieking, and calling Stramba and Luigina, who, notwithstanding they came up with all speed, found Pasquino not only dead, but already swollen from head to foot, and covered with black spots both on the face and on the body. Whereupon Stramba broke forth with, "Ah, wicked woman, thou hast poisoned him," and made such a din that 'twas heard by not a few that dwelt hard by the garden, who also hasted to the spot, and seeing Pasquino dead and swollen, and hearing Stramba bewail himself and accuse Simona of having maliciously poisoned him, while she, all but beside herself for grief to be thus suddenly bereft of her lover, knew not how to defend herself, did all with one accord surmise that 'twas even as Stramba said. Wherefore they laid hands on her, and brought her, still weeping bitterly, to the palace of the Podesta, where at the instant suit of Stramba, backed by Atticciato and Malaghevole, 2 other newly arrived friends of Pasquino, a judge forthwith addressed himself to question her of the matter, and being unable to discover that she had used any wicked practice, or was guilty, he resolved to take her with him and go see the corpse, and the place, and the manner of the death, as she had recounted it to him, for by her words he could not well understand it. So, taking care that there should be no disturbance, he had her brought to the place where Pasquino's corpse lay swollen like a tun, whither he himself presently came, and marvelling as he examined the corpse, asked her how the death had come about. Whereupon, standing by the sage bush, she told him all that had happened, and that he might perfectly apprehend the occasion of the death, she did as Pasquino had done, plucked one of the leaves from the bush, and rubbed her teeth with it. Whereupon Stramba and Atticciato, and the rest of the friends and comrades of Pasquino, making in the presence of the judge open mock of what she said, as an idle and vain thing, and being more than ever instant to affirm her guilt, and to demand the fire as the sole condign penalty, the poor creature that, between grief for her lost lover and dread of the doom demanded by Stramba, stood mute and helpless, was stricken no less suddenly, and in the same manner, and for the same cause, to wit, that she had rubbed her teeth with the sage leaf, as Pasquino, to the no small amazement of all that were present. O happy souls for whom one and the same day was the term of ardent love and earthly life! Happier still, if to the same bourne ye fared. Ay, and even yet more happy, if love there be in the other world, and there, even as here, ye love. But happiest of all Simona, so far as we, whom she has left behind, may judge, in that fortune brooked not that the witness of Stramba, Atticciato, and Malaghevole, carders, perchance, or yet viler fellows, should bear down her innocence, but found a more seemly issue, and appointing her a like lot with her lover, gave her at once to clear herself from their foul accusation, and to follow whither the soul that she so loved of her Pasquino had preceded her. The judge, and all else that witnessed the event, remained long time in a sort of stupefaction, knowing not what to say of it. But at length recovering his wits, the judge said, "'Twould seem that this sage is poisonous, which the sage is not used to be. Let it be cut down to the roots and burned, lest another suffer by it in like sort." Which the gardener, proceeding to do in the judge's presence, no sooner had he brought the great bush down, than the cause of the death of the 2 lovers plainly appeared. For underneath it was a toad of prodigious dimensions, from whose venomous breath, as they conjectured, the whole of the bush had contracted a poisonous quality. Around which toad, none venturing to approach it, they set a stout ring fence of faggots, and burned it together with the sage. So ended Master Judge's inquest on the death of hapless Pasquino, who, with his Simona, swollen as they were buried by Stramba, Atticciato, Guccio Umbratta, and Malaghevole in the church of San Paolo, of which, as it so happened, they were parishioners. End of Day 4, the 7th Story.
Day 4, the 8th Story. Girolamo loves Salvestra. Yielding to his mother's prayers, he goes to Paris. He returns to find Salvestra married. He enters her house by stealth, lays himself by her side, and dies. He is borne to the church, where Salvestra lays herself by his side, and dies.
When Emilia's story was done, Neifile at a word from the king thus began.
Some there are, noble ladies, who, methinks, deem themselves to be wiser than the rest of the world, and are, in fact, less so, and by consequence presume to measure their wit against not only the counsels of men, but the nature of things; which presumption has from time to time been the occasion of most grievous mishaps, but nought of good was ever seen to betide thereof. and as there is nought in nature that brooks to be schooled or thwarted so ill as love, the quality of which is such that it is more likely to die out of its own accord than to be done away of set purpose, I am minded to tell you a story of a lady, who, while she sought to be more wise than became her, and than she was, and indeed than the nature of the matter wherein she studied to show her wisdom allowed, thinking to unseat love from the heart that he had occupied, and wherein perchance the stars had established him, did in the end banish at one and the same time love and life from the frame of her son. Know then that, as 'tis related by them of old time, there was once in our city a very great and wealthy merchant, Leonardo Sigieri by name, who had by his lady a son named Girolamo, after whose birth he departed this life, leaving his affairs in meet and due order. And well and faithfully were they afterwards administered in the interest of the boy by his mother and guardians. As he grew up, consorting more frequently with the neighbours' children than any others of the quarter, he made friends with a girl of his own age that was the daughter of a tailor, and in course of time this friendship ripened into a love so great and vehement that Girolamo was ever ill at ease when he saw her not. Nor was her love for him a whit less strong than his for her. Which his mother perceiving would not seldom chide him therefore, and chastise him, and as Girolamo could not give it up, she confided her distress to his guardians, speaking, for by reason of her boy's great wealth she thought to make, as it were, an orange tree out of a bramble, on this wise: This boy of ours, who is now scarce 14 years old, is so in love with a daughter of one of our neighbours, a tailor, Salvestra is the girl's name, that if we part them not, he will, peradventure, none else witting, take her to wife some day, and I shall never be happy again. Or if he see her married to another, he will pine away. To prevent which, methinks you could do well to send him away to distant parts on the affairs of the shop. For so, being out of sight, she will come at length to be out of mind, and then we can give him some well-born girl to wife. Whereto the guardians answered that 'twas well said, and that it should be so done to the best of their power. So they called the boy into the shop, and one of them began talking to him very affectionately on this wise: My son, thou art now almost grown up. 'Twere well thou shouldst now begin to learn something for thyself of thy own affairs. Wherefore we should be very well pleased if thou wert to go stay at Paris a while, where thou wilt see how we trade with not a little of thy wealth, besides which thou wilt there become a much better, finer, and more complete gentleman than thou couldst here. And when thou hast seen the lords and barons and seigneurs that there are in plenty, and hast acquired their manners, thou canst return hither. The boy listened attentively, and then answered shortly that he would have none of it, for he supposed he might remain at Florence as well as another. Whereupon the worthy men plied him with fresh argument, but were unable to elicit other answer from him, and told his mother so. Whereat she was mightily incensed, and gave him a great scolding, not for his refusing to go to Paris, but for his love. Which done, she plied him with soft wheedling words, and endearing expressions, and gentle entreaties, that he would be pleased to do as his guardians would have him. Whereby at length she prevailed so far that he consented to go to Paris for a year and no more, and so 'twas arranged. To Paris accordingly our ardent lover went, and there under one pretext or another was kept for 2 years. He returned more in love than ever, to find his Salvestra married to a good youth that was a tent-maker. Whereat his mortification knew no bounds. But seeing that what must be, he sought to compose his mind, and having got to know where she lived, he took to crossing her path, according to the wont of young men in love, thinking that she could no more have forgotten him than he her. 'Twas otherwise, however. She remembered him no more than if she had never seen him, or if she had any recollection of him she dissembled it, whereof the young man was very soon ware to his extreme sorrow. Nevertheless he did all that he could to recall himself to her mind, but as thereby he seemed to be nothing advantaged, he made up his mind, though he should die for it, to speak to her himself. So, being instructed as to her house by a neighbour, he entered it privily one evening, when she and her husband were gone to spend the earlier hours with some neighbours, and hid himself in her room behind some tent cloths that were stretched there, and waited till they were come back and gone to bed, and he knew the husband to be asleep. Whereupon he got him to the place where he had seen Salvestra lie down, and said, as he gently laid his hand upon her bosom, "O my soul, art thou yet asleep?" The girl was awake, and was on the point of uttering a cry, when he forestalled her, saying, "Hush, for God's sake, I am thy Girolamo." Whereupon she, trembling in every limb, "Nay, but for God's sake, Girolamo, be gone. 'Tis past the time of our childhood, when our love was excusable. Thou seest I am married, wherefore 'tis no longer seemly that I should care for any other man than my husband. And so by the one God I pray thee be gone, for if my husband were to know that thou art here, the least evil that could ensue would be that I should never more be able to live with him in peace or comfort, whereas, having his love, I now pass my days with him in tranquil happiness." Which speech caused the young man grievous distress, but 'twas in vain that he reminded her of the past, and of his love that distance had not impaired, and therewith mingled many a prayer and the mightiest protestations. Wherefore, yearning for death, he besought her at last that she would suffer him to lie a while beside her, till he got some heat, for he was chilled through and through, waiting for her, and promised her that he would say never a word to her, nor touch her, and that as soon as he was a little warmed he would go away. On which terms Salvestra, being not without pity for him, granted his request. So the young man lay down beside her, and touched her not, but gathering up into one thought the love he had so long borne her, the harshness with which she now requited it, and his ruined hopes, resolved to live no longer, and in a convulsion, without a word and with fists clenched, expired by her side. After a while the girl, marvelling at his continence, and fearing lest her husband should awake, broke silence, saying, "Nay, but Girolamo, why goest thou not?" But receiving no answer, she supposed that he slept. Wherefore, reaching forth her hand to arouse him, she touched him, and found him to her great surprise cold as ice. And touching him again and again somewhat rudely, and still finding that he did not stir, she knew that he was dead. Her grief was boundless, and 'twas long before she could bethink her how to act. But at last she resolved to sound her husband's mind as to what should be done in such a case, without disclosing that 'twas his own. So she awakened him, and told him how he was then bested, as if it were the affair of another, and then asked him, if such a thing happened to her, what course he would take. The good man answered that he should deem it best to take the dead man privily home, and there leave him, bearing no grudge against the lady, who seemed to have done no wrong. "And even so," said his wife, "it is for us to do." And taking his hand she laid it on the corpse, whereat he started up in consternation and struck a light, and without further parley with his wife, clapped the dead man's clothes upon him, and forthwith, confident in his own innocence, raised him on his shoulders and bore him to the door of his house, where he set him down and left him. Day came, and the dead man being found before his own door, There was a great stir made, particularly by his mother. The body was examined with all care from head to foot, and no wound or trace of violence being found on it, the physicians were on the whole of opinion that, as the fact was, the man had died of grief. So the corpse was borne to a church, and thither came the sorrowing mother and other ladies, her kinswomen and neighbours, and began to wail and mourn over it without restraint, after our Florentine fashion. And when the wailing had reached its height, the good man in whose house the death had occurred said to Salvestra, "Go wrap a mantle about thy head, and hie thee to the church, whither Girolamo has been taken, and go about among the women and list what they say of this matter, and I will do the like among the men, that we may hear if aught be said to our disadvantage." The girl assented, for with tardy tenderness she now yearned to look on him dead, whom living she would not solace with a single kiss, and so to the church she went. Ah, how marvellous to whoso ponders it is the might of love, and how unsearchable his ways! That heart, which, while fortune smiled on Girolamo, had remained sealed to him, opened to him now that he was fordone, and kindling anew with all its old flame, melted with such compassion that no sooner saw she his dead face, as she there stood wrapped in her mantle, than, edging her way forward through the crowd of women, she stayed not till she was beside the corpse, and there, uttering a piercing shriek, she threw herself upon the dead youth, and as her face met his, and before she might drench it with her tears, grief that had reft life from him had even so reft it from her. The women strove to comfort her, and bade her raise herself a little, for as yet they knew her not. Then, as she did not arise, they would have helped her, but found her stiff and stark, and so, raising her up, they in one and the same moment saw her to be Salvestra, and dead. Whereat all the women that were there, overborne by a redoubled pity, broke forth in wailing new and louder far than before. From the church the bruit spread itself among the men, and reached the ears of Salvestra's husband, who, deaf to all that offered comfort or consolation, wept a long while. After which he told to not a few that were there what had passed in the night between the youth and his wife. And so 'twas known of all how they came to die, to the common sorrow of all. So they took the dead girl, and arrayed her as they are wont to array the dead, and laid her on the same bed beside the youth, and long time they mourned her. Then they were both buried in the same tomb, and thus those whom love had not been able to wed in life were wedded by death in indissoluble union. End of Day 4, the 8th Story.
Day 4, the 9th Story. Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon slays his wife's paramour, Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, and gives her his heart to eat. She, coming to wit thereof, throws herself from a high window to the ground, and dies, and is buried with her lover.
Nay, Philip's story, which had not failed to move the gossips to no little pity, being ended, none now remained to speak but the king, and Dioneo, whose privilege the king was minded not to infringe, wherefore he thus began.
I propose, compassionate my ladies, to tell you a story, which, seeing that you so commiserate ill-starred loves, may claim no less a share of your pity than the last, insomuch as they were greater folks of whom I shall speak, and that which befell them was more direful. You are to know then, as the Provençals relate, that there was in Provence 2 noble knights, each having castles and vassals under him, the one Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon, and the other Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang. And being both most doughty warriors, they were as brothers, and went ever together, and bearing the same device to tournament or joust or other passages of arms. And albeit each dwelt in his own castle, and the castles were a good 10 miles apart, it nevertheless came to pass that Sieur Guillaume de Roussillon, having a most lovely lady and amorous withal to wife, Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, for all they were such friends and comrades, became inordinately enamoured of the lady, who by this, that, and the other sign that he gave, discovered his passion, and knowing him for the most complete knight, was flattered, and returned it, insomuch that she yearned and burned for him above all else in the world, and waited only till he should make his suit to her, as before long he did, and so they met from time to time, and great was their love. Which intercourse they ordered with so little discretion that 'twas discovered by the husband, who was very wroth, insomuch that the great love which he bore to Cabestang was changed into mortal enmity, and, dissembling it better than the lovers their love, he made his mind up to kill Cabestang. Now it came to pass that, while Roussillon was in this frame, a great tourney was proclaimed in France, whereof Roussillon sent forth word to Cabestang, and bade him to his castle. So he reminded to come, that there they might discuss whether or no to go to the tourney, and how. Cabestang was overjoyed, and made answer that he would come to sup with him the next day without fail. Which message being delivered, Roussillon wist that the time was come to slay Cabestang. So next day he armed himself, and attended by a few servants took horse, and about a mile from his castle lay in ambush in a wood through which Cabestang must needs pass. He waited for some time, then he saw Cabestang approach, unarmed, with 2 servants behind, also unarmed, for he was without thought of peril on Roussillon's part. So Cabestang came unto the place of Roussillon's choice, and then, fell and vengeful, Roussillon leapt forth lance in hand, and fell upon him, exclaiming, "Thou art a dead man!" And the words were no sooner spoken than the lance was through Cabestang's breast. Powerless either to defend himself, or even utter a cry, Cabestang fell to the ground, and soon expired. His servants waited not to see who had done the deed, but turned their horses' heads, and fled with all speed to their lord's castle. Roussillon dismounted, and opened Cabestang's breast with a knife, and took out the heart with his own hands, wrapped it up in a banderole, and gave it to one of his servants to carry. He then bade none make bold to breathe a word of the affair, mounted his horse, and rode back, 'twas not night, to his castle. The lady, who had been told that Cabestang was to come to supper that evening, was all impatience till he should come, and was greatly surprised to see her husband arrived without him. Wherefore, "How is this, my lord?" said she. "Why tarries Cabestang?" "Madam," answered her husband, "I have tidings from him that he cannot be here until tomorrow." Whereat the lady was somewhat disconcerted. Having dismounted, Roussillon called the cook, and said to him, "Here is a boar's heart, take it, and make thereof the daintiest and most delicious dish thou canst, and when I am set at table serve it in a silver porringer." So the cook took the heart, and expended all his skill and pains upon it, mincing it, and mixing with it plenty of good seasoning, and made thereof an excellent ragout. And in due time Sieur Guillaume and his lady sat them down to table. The meat was served, but Sieur Guillaume, his mind engrossed with his crime, ate but little. The cook set the ragout before him, but he, feigning that he cared to eat no more that evening, had it passed on to the lady, and highly commended it. The lady, nothing loath, took some of it, and found it so good that she ended by eating the whole. Whereupon, "Madam," quoth the knight, "how liked you this dish?" "In good faith, my lord," replied the lady, "not a little." "So help me God," returned the knight, "I dare to be sworn you did. 'Tis no wonder that you should enjoy that dead which you living enjoyed more than aught else in the world." For a while the lady was silent. Then, "How say you?" said she. "What is it you have caused me to eat?" "That which you have eaten," replied the knight, "was in good sooth the heart of Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, whom you, disloyal woman that you are, did so much love. For assurance whereof I tell you that, but a short while before I came back, I plucked it from his breast with my own hands." It boots not to ask if the lady was sorrow stricken to receive such tidings of her best beloved. But after a while she said, "'Twas the deed of a disloyal and recreant knight. For if I, unconstrained by him, made him lord of my love, and thereby did you wrong, 'twas I, not he, should have borne the penalty. But God forbid that fair, of such high excellence as the heart of a knight, so true and courteous as Sieur Guillaume de Cabestang, be followed by aught else." So saying, she started to her feet, and stepping back to a window that was behind her, without a moment's hesitation let herself drop backwards therein. The window was at a great height from the ground, so the lady was not only killed by the fall, but almost reduced to atoms. Stunned and conscience-stricken by the spectacle, and fearing the vengeance of the country folk and the Count of Provence, Sieur Guillaume had his horses saddled and rode away. On the morrow the whole countryside knew how the affair had come about, wherefore folk from both of the castles took the two bodies, and bore them with grief and lamentation exceeding great to the church in the lady's castle, and laid them in the same tomb, and caused verses to be inscribed thereof, signifying who they were that were there interred, and the manner and occasion of their death. End of Day 4, the 9th Story.
Day 4, the 10th Story. The wife of a leech, deeming her lover, who has taken an opiate, to be dead, puts him in a chest, which, with him therein, two usurers carry off to their house. He comes to himself, and is taken for a thief. But, the lady's maid giving the Signory to understand that she had put him in the chest, which the usurers stole, he escapes the gallows, and the usurers are mulcted in moneys for the theft of the chest.
Now that the king had told his tale, it only remained for Dioneo to do his part, which he witting, and being thereto bidden by the king, thus began.
So have I, to say naught of you, my ladies, been of iron and heart, to hear the woeful histories of ill-starred love, insomuch that I have desired of all things that they might have an end. Wherefore, now that, thank God, ended they are, unless I were minded, which God forbid, to add to such pernicious stuff a supplement of the like evil quality, no such dolorous theme do I purpose to ensue, but to make a fresh start with somewhat of a better and more cheerful sort, which perchance may serve to suggest to-morrow's argument. You are to know then, fairest my damsels, that 'tis not long since there dwelt at Salerno a leech most eminent in surgery, his name Master Mazzeo della Montagna, who in his extreme old age took to a wife a fair damsel of the same city, whom he kept in nobler and richer array of dresses and jewels, and all other finery that the sex affects, than any other lady in Salerno. Howbeit she was none too warm most of her time, being ill covered abed by the doctor, who gave her to understand, even as Messer Ricciardo de Cinzica, of whom we spoke a while since, taught his lady the feasts, that for once a man lay with a woman, he needed I know not how many days to recover, and the like nonsense, whereby she lived as ill content as might be, and lacking neither sense nor spirit, she determined to economize at home, and taking to the street, to live at others' expense. So, having passed in review divers young men, she at last found one that was to her mind, on whom she set all her heart and hopes of happiness, which the gallant perceiving was mightily flattered, and in like manner gave her all his love. Rogero de Jeroli, such was the gallant's name, was of noble birth, but of life and conversation so evil and reprehensible, that kinsman or friend he had none left that wished him well, or cared to see him, and all Salerno knew him for a common thief and rogue of the vilest character. Whereof the lady took little heed, having a mind to him for another reason, and so, with the help of her maid, she arranged a meeting with him. But after they had solaced themselves a while, the lady began to censure his past life, and to implore him for love of her to depart from such evil ways, and to afford him the means thereto, she from time to time furnished him with money. While thus, with all discretion, they continued their intercourse, it chanced that a man halt of one of his legs was placed under the leech's care. The leech saw what was amiss with him, and told his kinsfolk that unless a gangrened bone that he had in his leg were taken out, he must die, or have the whole leg amputated; that if the bone were removed he might recover, but that otherwise he would not answer for his life. whereupon the relatives assented that the bone should be removed, and left the patient in the hands of the leech, who, deeming that by reason of the pain 'twas not possible for him to endure the treatment without an opiate, caused to be distilled in the morning a certain water of his own concoction, whereby the patient, drinking it, might be ensured sleep during such time as he deemed the operation, which he meant to perform about vespers, would occupy. In the meantime he had the water brought into his house, and set it in the window of his room, telling no one what it was. But when the vesper hour was come, and the leech was about to visit his patient, a messenger arrived from some very great friends of his at Amalfi, bearing tidings of a great riot there had been there, in which not a few had been wounded, and bidding him on no account to omit to hie him thither forthwith. Wherefore the leech put off the treatment of the leg to the morrow, and took boat to Amalfi, and the lady, knowing that he would not return home that night, did as she was wont in such a case, to wit, brought Ruggieri in privily, and locked him in her chamber until certain other folk that were in the house had gone to sleep. Ruggieri, then, being thus in the chamber awaiting the lady, and having, whether it was that he had a fatiguing day, or eaten something salt, or perchance that 'twas his habit of body, a mighty thirst, glancing at the window, caught sight of the bottle containing the water which the leech had prepared for the patient, and taking it to be drinking water, set it to his lips, and drank it all, and in no long time fell into a deep sleep. So soon as she was able, the lady hied her to the room, and there, finding Ruggieri asleep, touched him, and softly told him to get up. To no purpose, however, he neither answered nor stirred a limb. Wherefore the lady, rather losing patience, applied somewhat more force, and gave him a push, saying, "Get up, sleepy head. If thou hadst a mind to sleep, thou shouldst have gone home, and not have come hither." Thus pushed, Ruggieri fell down from a box on which he lay, and falling showed no more sign of animation than if he had been a corpse. The lady, now somewhat alarmed, essayed to lift him, and shook him roughly, and took him by the nose, and pulled him by the beard, again to no purpose. He had tethered his ass to a stout pin, so the lady began to fear he must be dead. However, she went on to pinch him shrewdly, and singe him with the flame of a candle. But when these methods also failed, she, being, for all she was a leech's wife, no leech herself, believed for sure that he was dead. And as there was naught in the world that she loved so much, it boots not to ask if she were sore distressed. Wherefore, silently, for she dared not lament aloud, she began to weep over him, and bewail such a misadventure. But after a while, fearing lest her loss should not be without sequel of shame, she bethought her that she must contrive without delay to get the body out of the house, and standing in need of another's advice, she quietly summoned her maid, showed her the mishap that had befallen her, and craved her counsel. Whereat the maid marvelled not a little, and she too fell to pulling Ruggieri this way and that, and pinching him, and, as she found no sign of life in him, concurred with her mistress that he was verily dead, and advised her to remove him from the house. "And where," said the lady, "shall we put him, that to-morrow, when he is discovered, it be not suspected that 'twas hence he was carried?" "Madam," answered the maid, "late last evening I marked in front of our neighbour the carpenter's shop a chest, not too large, which, if he have not put it back in the house, will come in very handy for our purpose, for we will put him inside, and give him 2 or 3 cuts with a knife, and so leave him. When he is found, I know not why it should be thought that 'twas from this house rather than from any other that he was put there. Nay, as he was an evil liver, 'twill be more likely supposed that as he hied him on some evil errand, some enemy slew him, and then put him in the chest." The lady said that there was naught in the world she might so ill brook as that Ruggieri should receive any wound, but with that exception she approved her maid's proposal, and sent her to see if the chest was still where she had seen it. The maid, returning, reported that it was, and being young and strong, got Ruggieri, with the lady's help, upon her shoulders, and so the lady going before to espy if any folk came that way, and the maid following, they came to the chest, and having laid Ruggieri therein, closed it, and left him there. Now a few days before, 2 young men that were usurers had taken up their quarters in a house a little further on. They had seen the chest during the day, and being short of furniture, and having a mind to make great gain with little expenditure, they had resolved that if it was still there at night they would take it home with them. So at midnight forth they hied them, and finding the chest, were at no pains to examine it closely, but forthwith, though it seemed somewhat heavy, bore it off to their house, and set it down beside a room in which their women slept, and without being at pains to adjust it too securely, they left it there for the time, and went to bed. Towards matins, Ruggieri, having had a long sleep, and digested the draught, and exhausted its efficacy, awoke, but albeit his slumber was broken, and his senses had recovered their powers, yet his brain remained in a sort of torpor, which kept him bemused for some days, and when he opened his eyes, and saw nothing, and stretched his hands hither and thither, and found himself in the chest, it was with difficulty that he collected his thoughts. "How is this?" he said to himself. "Where am I? Do I sleep or wake? I remember coming this evening to my lady's chamber, and now it seems I am in a chest. What means it? Can the leech have returned, or somewhat else have happened that caused the lady, while I slept, to hide me here?" That was it, I suppose. Without a doubt it must have been so. And having come to this conclusion, he composed himself to listen, if haply he might hear something. And being somewhat ill at ease in the chest, which was none too large, and the side on which he lay paining him, he must needs turn over to the other, and did so with such adroitness that, bringing his loins smartly against one of the sides of the chest, which was set on an uneven floor, he caused it to tilt and then fall, and such was the noise it made as it fell, that the women that slept there awoke, albeit for fear they kept silence. Ruggieri was not a little disconcerted by the fall, but, finding that thereby the chest was come open, he judged that, happen what might, he would be better out of it than in it, and not knowing where he was, and being otherwise at his wit's end, he began to grope about the house, if haply he might find a stair or door, whereby he might take himself off. Hearing him thus groping his way, the alarmed women gave tongue with "Who is there?" Ruggieri, not knowing the voice, made no answer. Wherefore the women fell to calling the two young men, who, having had a long day, were fast asleep, and heard naught of what went on, which served to increase the fright of the women, who rose and got them to divers windows, and raised the cry, "Take thief! Take thief!" At which summons there came running from divers quarters not a few of the neighbours, who got into the house by the roof, or otherwise, as each best might. Likewise the young men, aroused by the din, got up, and Ruggieri, being now all but beside himself for sheer amazement, and not knowing whither to turn him to escape them, they took him and delivered him to the officers of the governor of the city, who, hearing the uproar, had hasted to the spot. And so he was brought before the governor, who, knowing him to be held of all a most arrant evildoer, put him forthwith to the torture, and upon his confessing that he had entered the house of the usurers with intent to rob, was minded to make short work of it, and have him hanged by the neck. In the morning 'twas bruited throughout all Salerno that Ruggieri had been taken a thieving in the house of the usurers, whereat the lady and her maid were all amazement and bewilderment, insomuch that they were within an ace of persuading themselves that what they had done the night before they had not done, but had only dreamt it. Besides which, the peril in which Ruggieri stood caused the lady such anxiety as brought her to the verge of madness. Shortly after half tierce, the leech, being returned from Amalfi, and minded now to treat his patient, called for his water, and finding the bottle empty, made a great commotion, protesting that naught in his house could be left alone. The lady, having other cause of annoy, lost temper, and said, "What would you say, master, of an important matter, when you raise such a din because a bottle of water has been upset? Is there never another to be found in the world?" "Madam," replied the leech, "thou takest this to have been mere water. 'Twas no such thing, but an artificial water of a soporiferous virtue." And he told her for what purpose he had made it. Which the lady no sooner heard than, guessing that Ruggieri had drunk it, and so had seemed to them to be dead, she said, "Master, we know it not. Wherefore make you another?" And so the leech, seeing there was no help for it, had another made. Not long after, the maid, who by the lady's command had gone to find out what folk said of Ruggieri, returned, saying, "Madam, of Ruggieri they say naught but evil. nor, by what I have been able to discover, has he friend or kinsman that has or will come to his aid, and 'tis held for certain that to-morrow the static will have him hanged. Besides which, I have to tell you, which will surprise you, for methinks I have found out how he came into the usurer's house. List, then, how it was. You know the carpenter in front of whose shop stood the chest we put Ruggieri in. He had to-day the most violent altercation in the world with one to whom it would seem the chest belongs, by whom he was required to make good the value of the chest. To which he made answer that he had not sold it, but that it had been stolen from him in the night. Not so, said the other, thou soldst it to the two usurers, as they themselves told me last night, when I saw it at their house at the time Ruggieri was taken. They lie, replied the carpenter. I never sold it to them, but they must have stolen it from me last night. Go we to them. So with one accord off they went to the usurer's house, and I came back here. And so, you see, I make out that 'twas on such wise that Ruggieri was brought when he was found. But how he came to life again I am at a loss to conjecture. The lady now understood exactly how things were, and accordingly told the maid what she had learnt from the leech, and besought her to aid her to get Ruggieri off, for so she might, if she would, and at the same time preserve her honour. Madam, said the maid, do but show me how, and glad I shall be to do just as you wish. Whereupon the lady, to whom necessity taught invention, formed her plan on the spur of the moment, and expounded it in detail to the maid, who, as the first step, hied her to the leech, and weeping thus addressed him: Sir, it behoves me to ask your pardon of a great wrong that I have done you. And what may that be? inquired the leech. Sir, said the maid, who ceased not to weep, you know what manner of man is Ruggieri de Jeroli. Now he took a fancy to me, and partly for fear, partly for love, I this year agreed to be his mistress, and knowing yester eve that you were from home, he coaxed me into bringing him into your house to sleep with me in my room. Now he was athirst, and I, having no mind to be seen by your lady, who was in the hall, and knowing not whether I might sooner betake me for wine or water, bethought me that I had seen a bottle of water in your room, and ran and fetched it, and gave it to him to drink, and then put the bottle back in the place whence I had taken it, touching which I find that you have made a great stir in the house. Verily, I confess that I did wrong, but who is there that does not wrong sometimes? Sorry indeed am I to have so done, but 'tis not for such a cause, and that which ensued thereon, that Ruggieri should lose his life. Wherefore I do most earnestly beseech you pardon me, and suffer me to go help him as best I may be able. Wroth though he was at what he heard, the leech replied in a bantering tone: Thy pardon thou hast by thine own deed. For whereas thou didst last night think to have with thee a gallant that would thoroughly dust thy pelisse for thee, he was but a sleepy head. Wherefore get thee gone, and do what thou mayest for the deliverance of thy lover, and for the future look thou bring him not into the house, else I will pay thee for that turn and this to boot. The maid, deeming that she had come off well in the first brush, hied her with all speed to the prison where Ruggieri lay, and by her cajoleries prevailed upon the warders to let her speak with him, and having told him how he must answer the static if he would get off, she succeeded in obtaining pre-audience of the static, who, seeing that the baggage was lusty and mettlesome, was minded, before he heard her, to grapple her with the hook, to which she was by no means averse, knowing that such a preliminary would secure her a better hearing. When she had undergone the operation and was risen, Sir, said she, you have here Ruggieri de Jeroli, apprehended on a charge of theft, which charge is false. Whereupon she told him the whole story from beginning to end, how she, being Ruggieri's mistress, had brought him into the leech's house, and had given him the opiate, not knowing it for such, and taking him to be dead, had put him in the chest. And then, recounting what she had heard pass between the carpenter and the owner of the chest, she showed him how Ruggieri came into the house of the usurers. Seeing that 'twas easy enough to find out whether the story were true, the static began by questioning the leech as to the water, and found that 'twas as she had said. He then summoned the carpenter, the owner of the chest, and the usurers, and after much further parley ascertained that the usurers had stolen the chest during the night and brought it into their house. Finally, he sent for Ruggieri, and asked him where he had lodged that night. To which Ruggieri answered that where he had lodged he knew not, but he well remembered going to pass the night with Master Mazzeo's maid, in whose room he had drunk some water by reason of a great thirst that he had. But what happened to him afterwards, except that when he awoke he found himself in the chest in the house of the usurers, he knew not. All which matters the Stedic heard with great interest, and caused the maid and Ruggieri and the carpenter and the usurers to rehearse them several times. In the end, seeing that Ruggieri was innocent, he released him, and mulcted the usurers in 15 ounces for the theft of the chest. How glad Ruggieri was thus to escape, it boots not to ask, and glad beyond measure was his lady, and so many a time did they laugh and make merry together over the affair, she and he and the dear maid that had proposed to give him a taste of the knife, and remaining constant in their love, they had ever better and better solace thereof, the like whereof befalls me, sans the being put in the chest. End of Day 4, the 10th Story.
Day the 4th. The Conclusion. Heartsore as the gentle ladies had been made by the preceding stories, this last of Dioneo provoked them to such merriment, more especially the passage about the Stedic on the hook, that they lacked not relief of the piteous mood engendered by the others. But the king, observing that the sun was now taking a yellowish tinge, and that the end of his sovereignty was come, in terms most courtly made his excuse to the fair ladies, that he had made so direful a theme, as lovers in felicity the topic of their discourse. After which he rose, took the laurel wreath from his head, and while the ladies watched to see to whom he would give it, set it graciously upon the blonde head of Fiammetta, saying, "Herewith I crown thee, as deeming that thou, better than any other, will know how to make tomorrow console our fair companions for the rude trials of today." Fiammetta, whose wavy tresses fell in a flood of gold over her white and delicate shoulders, whose softly rounded face was all radiant with the very tints of the white lily, blended with the red of the rose, who carried 2 eyes in her head that matched those of the peregrine falcon, while her tiny sweet mouth shewed a pair of lips that shone as rubies, replied with a smile, "And gladly take I the wreath, Philostrato, and that thou mayst more truly understand what thou hast done, it is my present will and pleasure that each make ready to discourse tomorrow of good fortune befalling lovers after divers direful or disastrous adventures." The theme propounded was approved by all, whereupon the queen called the seneschal, and having made with him all the meet arrangements, rose and gaily dismissed all the company until the supper hour. Wherefore, some straying about the garden, the beauties of which were not such as soon to pall, others bending their steps towards the mills that were grinding without, each as and where it seemed best, they took meanwhile their several pleasures. The supper hour come, they all gathered in their wonted order by the fair fountain, and in the gayest of spirits and well served they supped. Then, rising, they adversed them, as was their wont, to dance and song, and while Philomela led the dance, "Philostrato," said the queen, "being minded to follow in the footsteps of our predecessors, and that as by their, so by our command a song be sung, and well witting that thy songs are even as thy stories, to the end that no day but this be waxed with thy misfortunes, we ordain that thou give us one of them, whichever thou mayst prefer." Philostrato answered that he would gladly do so, and without delay began to sing on this wise:
Full well my tears attest, O traitor love, with what just cause the heart, with which thou once hath broken faith, doth smart. Love, when thou first didst in my heart enshrine her for whom I still sigh, alas, in vain, nor any hope do know, a damsel so complete thou didst me show, that light as air I counted every pain, wherewith, behest of thine, condemned my soul to pine. Ah, but I gravely erred, the which to know, too late, alas, doth but enhance my woe. The cheat I knew not, ere she did leave me, she in whom alone my hopes were placed. For 'twas when I did most flatter myself with hope, and proudly boast myself her vassal lowliest and most graced, nor thought love might begrieve, nor dreamed he e'er might grieve. 'Twas then I found that she another's worth into her heart had taken, and cast me forth. A plant of pain, alas, my heart did bear. What time my hapless self cast forth I knew, and there it doth remain, and day and hour I curse and curse again. When first that front of love shone on my view, that front so queenly fair, and bright beyond compare, wherefore at once my faith, my hope, my fire, my soul doth imprecate, ere she expire. My lord, thou knowest how comfortless my woe. Thou, love, my lord, whom thus I supplicate, with many a piteous groan, telling thee how I anguish, sore I groan, yearning for death my pain to mitigate. Come, death, and with one blow cut short my span, and so with my cursed life me of my frenzy ease, for wheresoever I go 'twill sure decrease. Save death, no way of comfort doth remain, no anodyne beside for this sore smart. The boon then, love bestow, and presently by death annul my woe, and from this abject life release my heart, since from me joy is ta'en, and every solace deign. My prayer to grant, and let my death the cheer complete that she now hath of her new fare. Song, it may be that no one shall thee learn, nor do I care, for none I wot so well, as I may chant thee so. This one behest I lay upon thee, go, hie thee to love, and him in secret tell how I my life do spurn, my bitter life, and yearn, that to a better harborage he bring me of all might and grace that owe him king. Full well my tears attest.
Philostratus' mood and its cause were made abundantly manifest by the words of this song, and perchance they had been made still more so by the looks of a lady that was among the dancers, had not the shades of night, which had now overtaken them, concealed the blush that suffused her face. Other songs followed until the hour for slumber arrived, whereupon, at the behest of the queen, all the ladies sought their several chambers. End of Day 4, the Conclusion.